Before he was Bavaria's royal mystery man, Ludwig II was just a lonely boy who really loved swans. While other noble kids were busy learning the fine art of warfare or how to marry into powerful families without making eye contact, Ludwig was more concerned with the spiritual meaning of moonlight and whether Lohengrin, the mythical swan knight, needed a roommate. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, why King Ludwig II built fairy castles, then vanished, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Born in 1845 in the palatial Nymphenburg Palace in Munich, Ludwig came into the world with every imaginable advantage, except maybe emotional support. His parents, Maximilian II and Princess Marie of Prussia, were a royal couple in the same way a cactus and a snow globe could technically be called a pair. They had next to nothing in common and even less warmth between them. Little Ludwig was effectively raised by governesses, tutors, and the echoes of Wagnerian myth bouncing around his decorative skull. His father, Maximilian, was a stern intellectual type with a passion for science and statecraft. Unfortunately, he also had the emotional availability of a brick wall. His mother, Marie, was deeply religious, often absent, and bless her, completely baffled by her son's refusal to enjoy horseback riding or church functions like a normal Bavarian prince. Instead of soldierly sports or political etiquette, Ludwig was obsessing over operas, old legends, and poetry that made Wuthering Heights look like a rom-com. From an early age, Ludwig developed a taste for the theatrical and dramatic. While most kids were dressing up as knights for playtime, he insisted on recreating full medieval scenes, complete with crowns, cloaks, and an alarming amount of ceremonial seriousness. He didn't just play king, he was king. The fact that he wasn't actually ruling anything yet was a minor technicality. By the time he was a teenager, Ludwig had become the royal equivalent of a Tumblr poet. His letters were filled with moody reflections on destiny, death, swans, mountains, moonlight, and of course, tragic love. If you're thinking, he sounds like a sensitive soul, you'd be right. If you're also thinking, he probably would have worn eyeliner in a modern high school, you'd also be right. And here's the kicker. He hated the ruling. Passionately. The very idea of parliamentary debates made his eyes glaze over faster than a day-old donut. Ludwig viewed ruling as a grubby world of compromise and unpleasant conversation. He wanted no part in it. His tutors would spend hours trying to explain constitutional monarchy, only to watch Ludwig stare wistfully out the window and ask if clouds could feel sadness. It wasn't just rulings he loathed. Ludwig also had a profound discomfort with people. He was shy, awkward, and introverted in the extreme. At formal dinners, he'd often go completely silent for long stretches, like a very fancy statue. This wasn't brooding charisma. This was full-on social shutdown. His relatives started calling him the Märchenkönig, the fairy tale king, even before he got around to building fairy tale castles, because he seemed to live in his own little enchanted bubble where real life simply didn't apply. And perhaps the most formative aspect of Ludwig's childhood, his intense love for Germanic mythology and romantic art. Stories like Tristan and Isolde, Parzival, and Lohengrin were more than bedtime tales. They were blueprints for how he wanted to live his life. He didn't want to rule Bavaria. He wanted to rescue maidens, ride into battle on a swan-shaped chariot, and cry beautifully under moonlight. Unfortunately, Bavaria didn't have a job opening for melancholy prince of aesthetic vibes. All of this created a perfect storm. A deeply sensitive, emotionally isolated, fantasy-obsessed boy was being trained to run a country he didn't understand, for a people he barely knew, using systems he actively disliked. The writing was already on the palace wall, and it was probably scrawled in Gothic script under a painting of a dying knight. In summary, Ludwig was not raised to be a practical king. He was raised accidentally and beautifully to be a myth. By the time he turned 18 and took the throne, He already had one foot in the fairy tale realm and the other dangling somewhere near reality, and with a growing taste for fantasy, solitude, and extremely elaborate architecture, Bavaria was about to find out what happens when a lonely dreamer gets an entire kingdom's budget. Spoiler: it involves a lot of chandeliers. In 1864, at the ripe age of 18, Ludwig II became the King of Bavaria, and while that sounds like a fantasy come true, riches, palaces, servants, fancy outfits, it was more like someone handing a reluctant teenager the nuclear codes and saying, "Good luck, champ." Ludwig's rise to the throne wasn't exactly a Cinderella moment. His father, King Maximilian II, died suddenly after a brief illness, and the royal court scrambled to place the crown on his son's head before anyone had a chance to ask, "Wait, isn't this the kid who reenacts opera scenes in full costume alone in the woods?" Ludwig wasn't ready at all. One day he was brooding romantically in towers, the next he was handed a kingdom and told to fix the economy. For a boy whose main life experience involved long walks, poetry, and dramatically sighing at tapestries, it was a bit of a shift. Almost immediately, Ludwig realized that kingship came with responsibilities, gross, boring responsibilities. You know, like military briefings, budget meetings, constitutional crises, and being nice to important people with mustaches. None of that sounded like fun. There were no chandeliers involved, not a single swan. What Ludwig wanted was to be a symbolic king, a sort of glittery mascot for the Bavarian spirit, occasionally waving from a balcony and maybe reciting a line from Tannhäuser while bathed in moonlight. What the government expected, however, was an active monarch who could manage a growing tangle of foreign alliances, parliamentary reforms, and looming wars with Prussia and Austria. Instead, they got Ludwig showing up late, if at all, and zoning out halfway through policy briefings as if he were waiting for a plot twist. Ministers quickly learned that he'd much rather talk about the acoustics in castle halls than the state of Bavarian agriculture. Worse still, Ludwig didn't even pretend to enjoy diplomacy. He famously once excused himself from a crucial negotiation because he had a more pressing appointment. That appointment: watching Wagner rehearse. Nothing screams state emergency like a dramatic tenor warming up in a velvet cape. Foreign dignitaries were confused. His advisors were exasperated. The people? Intrigued, but slightly concerned. Bavaria had just been handed a monarch who looked like a romantic oil painting and governed like a distracted theatre major. But Ludwig's apathy wasn't just stubbornness, it was philosophical. He genuinely believed the monarchy should represent the soul of the people, not the spreadsheets. He envisioned a nobler kind of kingship, one where art, beauty, and moral virtue triumphed over political bickering and sausage laws. In short, he wanted to rule like a character from an epic opera, not like a finance minister in a powdered wig. Unfortunately for Ludwig, Bavaria was not running on dreams and moonlight. The mid-19th century was a pressure cooker of wars. Germany was splintered into competing states, nationalism was rising, and Otto von Bismarck was busy uniting the German Empire like a Terminator in iron pants. Bavaria's survival depended on savvy deals, military alliances, and realpolitik, not on enchanted forests and marble staircases. Ludwig, meanwhile, responded to this storm of geopolitics by, well, not responding. In fact, one of his favorite pastimes during these years was disappearing for long stretches into the countryside, especially the Alps, where he'd retreat into secluded hunting lodges, sometimes for weeks. This wasn't for hunting, mind you. Ludwig rarely shot anything. He just liked the mountains, the silence, the trees, the dramatic landscapes that looked like the backdrop of a Wagner finale. As the pressure mounted, Ludwig's political disinterest didn't just continue, it calcified. When Bavaria eventually allied with Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War, despite Ludwig's barely audible protests, it was clear that the young king had little say in his own kingdom's fate. His ministers handled most decisions, he signed what he was told, and in return they tolerated his increasingly eccentric hobbies. It was a royal détente. They ruled the country, and he ruled the aesthetic. And so, within just a few short years of becoming king, Ludwig had become a constitutional figurehead. in a tailor-made fantasy world. He stopped holding regular audiences, he withdrew from Munich and its drab politics, and he began pouring his energy, and let's be honest, his soul into things he actually cared about: music, myth, and architecture. But we'll get to the castles later. For now, just picture it. A young monarch who hated conflict, feared people, and thought of royalty as an art form, suddenly asked to lead during one of Europe's most volatile eras. It's like asking a harpist to command a battlefield. Brave in theory, tragic in practice. In the end, Ludwig's reign was less ruler of Bavaria and more artistic director of Bavaria, starring in a production nobody else was watching. He wore the crown, yes, but the throne? He mostly avoided it, unless it had velvet cushions and dramatic lighting. Imagine being so obsessed with your favorite musician that you not only bankroll his life but also build castles based on his characters, install secret opera viewing rooms in your house, and refer to him in letters as your spiritual twin. Congratulations, you've just entered the glittering, horned-helmeted vortex that was King Ludwig II's relationship with Richard Wagner. Now, let's be clear. Wagner wasn't just any composer. He was a force of nature. He wrote music that sounded like gods were yelling at each other in German, which, to be fair, they usually were, and he had a flair for writing operas that lasted longer than most relationships. His works weren't entertainment, they were seismic events with orchestras large enough to qualify as small militias, and when Ludwig II first heard Wagner's music, it was love at first crescendo. The year was 1861. Ludwig was just 16 and sitting through a performance of Lohengrin, a romantic opera featuring knights, swans, magical boats, and women making highly questionable life choices. To Ludwig, it wasn't just music, it was a revelation. This wasn't opera, it was prophecy with string instruments. By the time he ascended the throne 3 years later, Ludwig had made up his mind. Bavaria didn't need military alliances, it needed more Wagner. So, in 1864, the freshly crowned, barely shaving Ludwig II did what any dreamy young monarch would do. He sent word to the exiled, broke, scandal-ridden Richard Wagner, inviting him to Munich with an all-expenses-paid ticket to relevance. And Wagner? He jumped at the offer like a man who'd just been told the tax collector died. Ludwig not only paid off Wagner's enormous debts, which included money owed to half the aristocracy, and at least one guy named Hans, but gave him a house, a lavish salary, a theatre, and a royal endorsement so glowing it practically needed sunglasses. It was the 19th century version of going viral, with a sugar daddy attached. Wagner moved into Munich like he owned the place, which financially speaking he sort of did, and Ludwig was entranced. The two men spent long nights discussing philosophy, mythology, art, and the future of German culture. Wagner wrote letters filled with flattery and poetic nonsense, and Ludwig responded like a starstruck fanboy with a castle. There were even rumors, persistent, juicy rumors, that Ludwig's devotion had crossed into romantic territory. While there's no firm historical evidence that anything physical happened, Ludwig's letters to Wagner were filled with emotional outpourings that make modern love texts look emotionally restrained. He called Wagner his dearest and sole companion, signed letters ever thine, and once referred to Wagner as the highest ideal of the artist king. Eat your heart out, fan fiction. But Wagner, for all his genius, was also a manipulative drama magnet. He had a talent for offending everyone, including Ludwig's ministers, Munich's elite, and polite society in general. He demanded ever more money, threw tantrums over stage design, and brought along his mistress, who was not well received at royal events, particularly when she wore floor-length velvet like it was chainmail. Eventually, even Ludwig's government, already on high alert from the king's opera-funded escapism, had had enough. They issued an ultimatum: either Wagner left Munich, or they'd start considering the king's mental state more seriously than just a bit eccentric. Crushed but cornered, Ludwig agreed to send Wagner packing. He did it reluctantly, with many sighs, and only after giving him an estate, more money, and promises to stay friends. Like any true fanboy, he couldn't say no, even while being professionally ghosted. But Wagner was far from gone. Ludwig continued to support him from afar, including secretly funding the Bayreuth festival. Wagner's lifelong dream of an opera house built just to stage his own works. Yes, the entire building was basically one long monument of Wagner's ego. Ludwig didn't even attend the opening night. He just wanted it to exist, like a fan commissioning an enormous shrine and then saying, "No need to invite me, just keep being amazing." And Ludwig's obsession didn't stop with money. He began incorporating Wagnerian themes directly into his life-building rooms modeled after scenes in Tannhäuser, naming architectural features after Wagnerian characters, and referring to himself as Parsifal, the pure knight from one of Wagner's operas. It was less inspired by and more fully submerged in. So why did it matter? Because this wasn't just music. For Ludwig, Wagner's operas were the alternate universe he wished to live in, a place where kings were noble, suffering was glorious, and swans took you places instead of reality dragging you down. In a life filled with political disappointment and awkward small talk, Wagner gave Ludwig an epic, a script to follow, a dream to fund. In short, Wagner was the soundtrack to Ludwig's escape. The man wrote the music, and Ludwig tried to live inside it. And as we'll see as the story evolves, the result wasn't just daydreams and orchestras, it was stone, marble, gold, and fantasy carved into mountaintops. When most monarchs feel the weight of political pressure, they take up diplomacy, maybe launch a war, host a banquet or two. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, he grabbed a blueprint, squinted at a mountain and said, "I shall build a swan-shaped hallucination here," and thus began one of history's most extravagant, illogical, and thoroughly delightful architectural campaigns ever undertaken by a royal human, or perhaps by anyone not actively dreaming under anesthesia. It all started with Linderhof Palace, the architectural equivalent of a glittering diary entry. Nestled deep in the Bavarian Alps, Linderhof was Ludwig's first major project as king. He didn't inherit it, he reimagined it by demolishing most of the existing building and rebuilding it into something that screamed, "I am the ruler of a fictional land where everyone sings in German and everything is gold." He modeled it loosely after Versailles, but smaller and much more obsessed with personal comfort. Linderhof was designed for one resident, Ludwig himself. It had an elaborate hall of mirrors, where he could stare pensively into infinity, and a dining room table that lowered into the floor so he wouldn't have to eat in front of servants. Even his meals were shy. Then came the pièce de résistance, the Venus Grotto. Now, stay with me here. This wasn't just a room, it was a full-on artificial cave, complete with mood lighting, a lake, and a swan-shaped boat, all underground. Why? Because Ludwig wanted to recreate a scene from Wagner's opera Tannhäuser inside his home. He commissioned colored lights powered by one of the first private electric generators in Bavaria, making him a pioneer in theatrical lighting and a one-man audience to floating swan performances. Again, he built a private opera cave in his garden, for no one. But Ludwig was just getting warmed up. His next project, a castle so audacious, so picturesque, that it would later become the blueprint for Disney's Cinderella Castle. Ladies, gentlemen, and romantic eccentrics of all ages, welcome to Neuschwanstein. Neuschwanstein is perched high in the Bavarian mountains, like a swan-shaped crown glued onto the Alps. Construction began in 1869, and Ludwig dove into it with the enthusiasm of someone designing a home for a wizard king with a Wagner problem. He micromanaged every inch of it. Architects quit, budgets exploded. Deadlines were ignored like vegetables on a royal dinner plate. What he created was nothing short of medieval cosplay in stone. The outside looked like a 13th century fortress, but the inside was pure 19th century indulgence, ornate bedrooms, throne rooms, without actual thrones, and murals depicting scenes from Wagner's operas. That's right, this was the world's most expensive fan castle. It was less a residence and more a three-dimensional fan letter carved into a cliff. And once again, Ludwig had no intention of throwing royal balls or housing diplomats here. Neuschwanstein was his sanctuary. a place where he could retreat from the world and pretend that time and responsibilities were inconvenient rumors made up by other people. Not done yet, Ludwig decided he needed one more crown jewel, Herentiumsea, an island palace so lavish it makes Versailles look like a fixer-upper, inspired directly by Louis XIV because one Sun King clearly wasn't enough. Herentiumsea was meant to be Ludwig's own version of the French masterpiece, complete with a hall of mirrors, endless fountains, and rooms so elaborately gilded they looked like someone held a wedding between a jewelry box and an explosion. And yet, Ludwig barely stayed there. He visited a grand total of 10 days. Why build a Versailles on a lake you never visit? Because Ludwig wasn't creating homes. He was building symbols, monuments to a world that never existed but should have, at least in his mind. And here's the kicker. These castles weren't built with public approval or political purpose. They were passion projects, fantasy made stone, personal mythologies rendered in marble and gold. To Ludwig, they were necessary, spiritual even. To his ministers, they were financial sinkholes, elaborate backgrounds for a king who refused to be tagged in reality. Construction costs ballooned, deadlines disappeared into the mist, and Ludwig kept drawing up new ideas. He planned an enormous Chinese palace, a Byzantine dome, a Tower of Babel, probably. He had castle blueprints coming out of his royal ears. Thankfully, or perhaps tragically, most were never built, but the ones that were, they still stand today, testaments to one man's refusal to live in the era he was born into. Cathedrals of escape, sculptures of stubborn dreaminess, castles not for people, but for imagination. So yes, while other rulers built armies and alliances, Ludwig built staircases to nowhere, underground caves with floating boats, and chandeliers that probably had their own royal titles. He didn't govern Bavaria, he beautified it into a dreamscape and hid inside. Ludwig II didn't just build castles, he built stage sets for a play with exactly one actor himself. While most monarchs used their royal real estate to flaunt wealth, impress diplomats or throw lavish balls where powdered wigs collided on the dance floor, Ludwig approached his palaces like an introverted architect of whimsy. His motto might as well have been, "If I can hear you breathing, you're too close." Take Neuschwanstein, for instance, the fairy tale masterpiece perched on a Bavarian cliff like a Disney daydream. You'd expect royal guests, banquets, diplomats, and the occasional scandal to spill down its marble staircases. But Ludwig built it almost entirely for solo use. In fact, he rarely let anyone visit at all. If there was a red carpet, it was rolled out only for his horse-drawn carriage and maybe Wagner's ghost. Inside these marble and gold dreamscapes, Ludwig cultivated the kind of solitude most hermits can only aspire to. He didn't just enjoy being alone. He designed entire castles around the concept. At Linderhof Palace, he had a dining room table that lowered through the floor to be set in the kitchen below, then raised back up, just so he could avoid eye contact with servants. He called it the Tischlein deck dish, a table that sets itself. You could almost hear him saying, "I'd like to dine alone," but with the efficiency of a modern conveyor belt. This wasn't your average royal reclusiveness. This was luxury-level solitude. He commissioned lavish halls and glittering rooms, each meticulously decorated, only to wander them in silence, sometimes by candlelight, wearing theatrical costumes. At times he dressed as the Sun King. At others he imagined himself as Lohengrin, the Swan Knight from Wagner's operas. If that sounds like cosplay in a palace, well, it basically was. But why all this isolation? Part of it stemmed from Ludwig's overwhelming discomfort with the world outside his imagination. The court? Too stuffy. Diplomats? Too boring. Dinner parties? Too noisy. Ludwig didn't simply dislike small talk, he despised the entire genre of public interaction. His court was often baffled by his disappearing acts. He was known to vanish for days at a time, slipping away from Munich to the Alps like a dramatic squirrel, avoiding responsibilities. The deeper truth, however, was a profound and growing retreat from reality. Ludwig wasn't just building castles. He was constructing boundaries between himself and the world. His mental health was a subject of whispered concern even then. While some saw his behavior as eccentricity, others feared something more severe. But from Ludwig's perspective, these palaces weren't prisons. They were sanctuaries, gilded, chandelier-studded escapes from a cruel world that felt cold, chaotic, and crushing. And Ludwig wasn't just ignoring guests, he was also ignoring time. At Herrenchiemsee, his Versailles-inspired palace, he famously ordered the staff to set all clocks permanently to 4 a.m., his favorite hour. Why 4 a.m.? That was when he felt most inspired, most at peace, and most alone. His meals, outings, and even bath times were synced with this antisocial time zone, ensuring that if anyone did want to see him, they'd have to be extremely nocturnal or very lucky. His sense of isolation even extended to the architecture. At Neuschwanstein, Ludwig had an elaborate throne room designed, but never actually built a throne. There's a platform where the throne would go, surrounded by golden murals of saints and Byzantine opulence, but the seat itself, missing. It's as if Ludwig liked the idea of power but preferred not to sit in it. A throne, after all, implies other people might come and talk to you about taxes. In truth, the castles of Ludwig II were like elaborate diaries, filled not with ink but with stone, silk, and stained glass. Each room whispered his secrets, each corridor echoed his fantasies. His solitude wasn't a mistake, it was the point. And for all their grandeur, these places weren't meant to be shared. They were built so he could wander, reflect, and imagine in peace. Visitors today may gawk at the grandeur, but Ludwig's ghost would probably be annoyed by the foot traffic. Tourists shuffle through his once private kingdom like ants in sneakers, marveling at the gold leaf, snapping selfies in his quiet spaces. Somewhere, you imagine Ludwig sighing dramatically in his feathered cape, whispering, "Must they touch the banister?" Ultimately, Ludwig's castles weren't monuments to monarchy, they were shrines to solitude. In a world of politics, noise, and obligation, he chose stillness, beauty, and privacy. He didn't build Versailles 2.0 to entertain the masses. He built it so he could sit in a mirrored room, bathed in candlelight, listening to Wagner alone, undisturbed, and absolutely at home. Because when you're Ludwig II, the most important guest at the palace is you. By the time Ludwig II reached his castle-building stride, his architectural ambitions had evolved from whimsical to downright financially reckless. Bavaria, bless her royal purse strings, was being emptied faster than a candy store during a toddler stampede. You'd think running out of money would slow down a king's glittering plans, but Ludwig wasn't just building castles. He was constructing monuments to his imagination with a price tag that screamed, "Help me," in operatic falsetto. Let's be clear, Ludwig wasn't spending modestly. He was orchestrating a royal spending spree that made even Marie Antoinette look like a coupon clipper. Between Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, Ludwig had essentially turned the entire kingdom into a high-budget fantasy set. He spared no expense, literally, gold leaf ceilings. Yes, hall of mirrors modelled after Versailles. Absolutely. Artificial caves for moody gondola rides under fake stars. Naturally. Each project came with escalating costs, and Ludwig, not one to pause for financial reality, responded to this crisis with all the economic wisdom of a raccoon in a jewelry store. Rather than adjust his plans or consult his ministers, he doubled down, borrowing money from foreign banks, signing promissory notes like autographs, and ignoring every letter that started with "Your Majesty" about the national debt. His finance ministers were practically aging in dog years. They'd approach the king with ledgers, trying to explain that Bavaria was circling the financial drain. Ludwig, in turn, would listen politely, nod thoughtfully, and then order an ornate golden swan boat powered by footmen for his grotto. Because budgeting is for commoners, not men with a chandelier addiction. At one point, Bavaria's debts were so steep that foreign creditors began knocking at the kingdom's gates, figuratively and almost literally. Ludwig owed the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's money. Some officials begged him to stop. Others, fearing political collapse, plotted to intervene. But Ludwig, he kept drafting blueprints for another castle. This one floating, with unicorn sculptures, Okay, slight exaggeration, but you can't prove it wasn't on his mood board. And here's the kicker. Ludwig wasn't even spending public funds for public benefit. His projects didn't improve infrastructure, fund schools, or even provide royal banquets for nobles. These castles were private palaces. They weren't meant for court life. They were art installations that happened to have bedrooms. In effect, he turned Bavaria's economy into a personal GoFundMe for his fantasy life. Of course, one might argue he created jobs. Architects, artisans, sculptors, and builders had steady employment during Ludwig's reign, so in a way he was the most artist-friendly monarch in Europe. But that argument starts to wither when you realize the wages were being paid with borrowed money, and eventually there was no one left willing to lend to a king who thought a private opera box in every castle was essential. One of the most tragicomic moments came when Ludwig was served formal notices about his insolvency. His reaction? He demanded that his creditors be ignored and promptly commissioned more decor for Herrenchiemsee. Essentially, he pulled the royal version of "if I can't see the bill, it doesn't exist." The irony was thick. While Ludwig surrounded himself with gold, marble, and shimmering mosaics, Bavaria was teetering on fiscal collapse. Taxes rose, public services shrank, ministers panicked. Meanwhile, Ludwig was busy designing a staircase that looked good from both the top and the bottom because, apparently, symmetry mattered more than solvency. Eventually, it all came to a head. His own cabinet, desperate to save the kingdom from bankruptcy, and unwilling to wait for Ludwig to magically grow a financial conscience, took steps to remove him from power. But we're not quite there yet. This chapter of Ludwig's story is not just about numbers, it's about the dreamer king's deep disinterest in earthly limitations. For Ludwig, beauty mattered more than balance sheets. He viewed his reign as a canvas, not a responsibility. While other rulers counted coins, Ludwig counted chandeliers. While ministers stressed about deficit charts, Ludwig worried about ceiling frescoes. To his admirers, Ludwig was a misunderstood patron of the arts. To his critics, he was a reckless monarch with the spending habits of a magpie on espresso. Both might be right, but if there's one thing we know for sure, Ludwig II didn't just bankrupt a kingdom, he did it with flair, velvet drapes, and enough gold trim to blind the sun. If you've ever had the urge to gallop through a dark forest at midnight wearing a velvet cape and pretending you're a medieval hero on a noble quest, congratulations, you and Ludwig II of Bavaria have something in common. The difference is, Ludwig actually did it, repeatedly, with sleighs, footmen, torch-bearers, and occasionally a full-blown orchestra in tow. Because why dream when you can live inside one? By the time his finances were in full freefall, Ludwig had also gone full vampire mode. He flipped his daily schedule upside down, sleeping all day, rising with the moon, and spending the nighttime hours riding through the Bavarian countryside like a fairy tale character who refused to read the part where the kingdom collapses. He wasn't just an insomniac, he was committed. Ludwig arranged his court schedule so that meetings, correspondence, and even meals were held during the twilight hours. Breakfast at 6 p.m.? Sure. A long dinner at midnight? Naturally. Important royal business at 3 a.m.? You better bring a lantern and a dramatic sense of urgency. But the real magic happened outdoors, wrapped in furs and fantasy. Ludwig would command his servants to ready his custom-built sleigh. Not just any sleigh, mind you, this thing was more like a royal parade float on skis. It came equipped with gilded carvings, plush velvet seats, lanterns for ambiance, and a small team of footmen dressed like extras in a Wagner opera. If Santa Claus saw it, even he would feel underdressed. Sometimes Ludwig rode alone, other times he brought along a carefully curated entourage of torchbearers and attendants, who had the singular misfortune of having to jog through snow beside him in the dead of night, and all while he, in his royal finery, glided silently through the moonlit landscape, like the star of an overwrought romantic painting. He would choose his costumes with care. One night he might be a medieval knight in chainmail, the next a French sun king in full Louis XIV regalia. There were no limits, except perhaps the patience of his wardrobe attendants and the Bavarian weather forecast. Ludwig didn't believe in pajamas. He believed in pageantry. His favorite destinations? Remote lakes, quiet castles, shadowy forests. He wasn't rushing to appointments, he was seeking solitude. Ludwig had always been uncomfortable with the rigid formalities of public life, and as he grew more eccentric, the night became his safe haven. He could think, dream, and escape into the roles he found more comforting than his own reality. To the casual observer, it might have seemed wildly theatrical, but Ludwig wasn't doing this for attention, quite the opposite. He didn't want an audience. He was less look at me and more don't talk to me unless you're a ghost or a Wagnerian hero. His journeys were deeply personal expressions of his inner world, one where myth and moonlight blurred, and Bavaria's brooding forests became the backdrop to his operatic solitude. Of course, none of this helped his reputation among his ministers and family. As Ludwig slipped further into nocturnal eccentricity, whispers grew louder. Was he mad? Was he merely dramatic? It was hard to tell. After all, how many monarchs could you find riding through snowstorms in feathered hats at 2 a.m. quoting lines from Lohengrin? But this wasn't just escapism, it was spiritual for him. Ludwig saw the night as sacred, a realm of quiet beauty and reflection. Where others saw darkness, he saw theatre. It was during these silent journeys that he would compose letters, contemplate architecture, and mourn the loss of the pure romantic world he longed to live in. He wasn't trying to evade responsibility as much as rewrite the script of kingship itself, one where thrones were golden, emotions operatic, and reality conveniently optional. Perhaps the most telling detail of all, Ludwig had mirrors and candles placed in many of his nighttime haunts. Not for vanity, but for mood lighting. Even his solitude had a lighting designer. Eventually, Ludwig's night-riding habits would be used against him. His critics cited his odd hours, costumes, and increasingly isolated behavior as signs of delusion. But to Ludwig, it was simply living as he believed a king should, regal, romantic, ridiculously fabulous. So while Bavaria went to bed, its kings soared through the moonlit snow in a fur-lined sleigh, lit by firelight and fantasy, dressed not for comfort, but for legend. By the 1880s, King Ludwig II had become less of a monarch and more of a Bavarian bedtime story. The nocturnal king who built dream castles and galloped across moonlit forests in velvet capes. But behind the fairy tale facade, the kingdom's financial ledgers were bleeding red. Ludwig's ministers were sweating bullets, and everyone at court was whispering the same uncomfortable question: is the king okay? Spoiler alert. According to his cabinet, he absolutely was not. Let's rewind a bit. While Ludwig had always marched to the beat of a 48-piece Wagnerian orchestra playing only in his head, he wasn't dangerous. He wasn't launching wars, oppressing minorities, or hosting extravagant guillotine parties. No, his biggest crimes were building too many castles, dodging cabinet meetings, and spending money like he thought Bavaria had invented infinite credit. But to the government, these eccentricities were no longer charming. They were a liability, a very expensive one. And so the gears of royal bureaucracy began grinding toward what might be the most passive-aggressive coup in history. Enter Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a respected psychiatrist known for pioneering humane treatment of the mentally ill. He had one glaring problem. However, he had never once examined Ludwig in person. Not even a quick checkup or a "Hey, how's your mental state today, Your Majesty?" Instead, he based his diagnosis entirely on interviews with Ludwig's staff, who may or may not have exaggerated their stories, depending on whether they'd recently been yelled at for putting Ludwig's swan figurines in the wrong order. According to Gudden's written report, Ludwig suffered from paranoia, exhibited pathological extravagance, and was incapable of ruling. The king's ministers, desperate to stop the royal ATM machine before Bavaria went bankrupt over another porcelain chandelier shaped like Valhalla, seized on this with both hands, and all the enthusiasm of middle managers finally getting to fire their boss. On June 9, 1886, a declaration was signed that stripped Ludwig of his power. And how was this bombshell delivered to the king? With style, of course. In true theatrical fashion, A team of government officials, accompanied by a contingent of police and servants, stormed Neuschwanstein castle like a Victorian-era episode of Cops. Their goal: confront the king and serve him with the royal equivalent of a pink slip. But Ludwig, ever the dramatic lead in his own opera, was one step ahead. He had the castle locked down, the gates barricaded, and a few loyal servants manning the drawbridges. He was not about to let a bunch of bureaucrats ruin his moonlit fantasy life. For a brief shining moment, Ludwig staged a royal standoff. Unfortunately, his resistance didn't last long. The next day, officials caught up with him at Berg castle and placed him under arrest. Just like that, the Dream King was dethroned, not with a revolution or a civil war, but with paperwork, gossip, and a questionable diagnosis. The official story was clear. King Ludwig II was insane, and for the good of Bavaria he needed to be removed. But unofficially, things got murky. People started asking questions. Was Ludwig really mad, or just inconvenient? Was he mentally ill, or simply misunderstood? A square peg in a round crown. And perhaps more troubling, was his love of solitude and fantasy actually less dangerous than the cold pragmatism of the men who replaced him? Regardless of the truth, the damage was done. His uncle, Prince Luitpold, was appointed regent. The fairy king was now a royal prisoner, his palaces stripped of their master, the chandeliers unadmired, the swan motifs orphaned. Bavaria may have been saved from bankruptcy, but it had also lost its most fascinating and baffling monarch. The irony of Ludwig's fall is that it wasn't caused by war, scandal, or rebellion. He didn't cross the church, offend nobility, or commit treason. He was simply too much, too romantic, too expensive, too theatrical for the budget-conscious ministers of a very real, very tired kingdom. But Ludwig didn't go down without leaving a legacy. His forced removal became a cautionary tale in royal circles. Never get too obsessed with opera, and always double-check who's writing your medical evaluations. And to the Bavarian public, Ludwig transformed from an eccentric burden into a tragic, misunderstood figure, a king who dared to dream while the world demanded spreadsheets. Still, no one expected what would happen next, because barely 3 days after his removal, Ludwig would go for a walk with Dr. Gudden and never return. After being unceremoniously dethroned with the psychiatric equivalent of a Yelp review from strangers, King Ludwig II was quietly carted off to Castle Berg, a picturesque manor nestled on the serene shores of Lake Starnberg. It had once been a royal retreat, a place for quiet walks and elegant thoughts. Now it was a glorified birdcage for a king with clipped wings. The chandeliers still sparkled, the velvet still shimmered, but the doors were locked and the guards were armed. This was no vacation, it was velvet-lined exile. The decision to send Ludwig here wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Castle Berg was familiar and remote, close enough to Munich for oversight, but far enough to keep the mad king away from the spotlight and, perhaps more importantly, the general population. Bavaria's government wasn't in the mood for a counter-coup involving peasants with torches and Wagner on repeat. Better to stash Ludwig somewhere quiet, scenic, and out of reach. Inside the castle, Ludwig was placed under constant surveillance. His personal liberties were severely restricted. No more late-night sleigh rides, no unsolicited palace expansions, and definitely no commissioning of opera houses based on his dreams. Even his meals were closely monitored, possibly more out of fear he'd demand they be served by actors reenacting scenes from Tristan and Isolde than for any genuine medical concern. His only companion was the man who had helped declare him insane, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. Yes, the same psychiatrist who had diagnosed Ludwig without ever meeting him was now tasked with watching over his mental health up close. It was like being told your ex would now be your therapist, awkward, to say the least. Gudden was no fool, but his presence was complicated. On paper, he was there to protect the king and assess his condition more thoroughly. In practice, he was a handler, making sure Ludwig didn't sneak out a side window and reclaim the throne in a blaze of theatrical glory. Their relationship was strained at best, and downright tense at worst. Ludwig, still firmly convinced he'd been wronged, treated Gudden with cold civility. Gudden, in turn, tried to maintain professional detachment, but the atmosphere at Castle Berg could curdle fresh milk, and it wasn't just the doctor that Ludwig distrusted. The household staff had been chosen by the very ministers who ousted him. They weren't loyal retainers, they were glorified babysitters. Some were indifferent, others resentful, and more than a few were probably hoping he'd go quietly and make room for a regent with less expensive hobbies. In Ludwig's eyes, they were spies. In their eyes, he was a fallen monarch who still thought he ruled the moon. Despite the gilded surroundings, Ludwig's life shrank to a narrow, controlled routine. He was allowed to walk the castle grounds, but only under supervision. He could write letters, but not freely. He could read, reflect and ponder, but mostly in solitude. It was like being given a front-row seat to his own downfall, with no intermission and a very unsatisfying script. Still, Ludwig was not entirely broken. He plotted. He wrote passionate notes proclaiming his innocence. He considered escape. He may have even flirted with the idea of rallying loyalists, storming Munich, and restoring the monarchy with one dramatic gesture, preferably involving lightning, swans and a full orchestra. But reality for once refused to cooperate. The government, meanwhile, remained nervous. They had removed Ludwig, but public sentiment was shifting. Whispers were beginning to spread. Was the king really mad, or just eccentric? People missed his castles. They missed his mystique. They missed the idea that Bavaria could still be magical instead of merely administrative. Ministers feared that Ludwig's presence, even as a prisoner, might stir rebellion. And Ludwig? He was losing patience. Tension grew thick enough to cut with a ceremonial sword. Ludwig and Gudden argued more frequently. Reports suggest the king demanded freedom, or at least the dignity of a private conversation without armed supervision. Gudden, committed to his duty and possibly his professional reputation, refused. And so the stage was set for what would become one of the most baffling and haunting chapters in European royal history. On June 13, 1886, Ludwig asked to take an evening walk with Gudden. No guards, just the two of them, along the shores of Lake Starnberg. It seemed innocuous, just a moment of air and quiet before another sleepless royal night. They left the castle shortly after 6 p.m. They never returned. By twilight, Castle Berg was no longer a prison. It was a crime scene, or perhaps something far more tragic. The swans were still on the lake, the stars still shimmered above, but the fairy tale had taken a sharp, cold turn. The king in captivity was now a ghost in the mist. On June 13, 1886, Bavaria woke up to a headline that sounded like the plot of a badly written Gothic novel. King Ludwig II, royal dreamer, amateur architect, and part-time moonlight sleigh rider, was dead. But it wasn't just that he died, it was how he died. Because this wasn't some tragic, dramatic fall from a tower or even a noble battlefield demise. No, Ludwig II, the fairy tale king, was found floating in the shallow, mucky waters of Lake Starnberg, alongside the very doctor meant to be watching over him. The official story reads like someone's excuse when they forget to do their homework. Ludwig drowned, in water that in most areas barely reached chest height. You could practically sit down and still breathe. Naturally, this raised more eyebrows than one of Ludwig's extravagant eyebrow-shaped fountains. And as theories bubbled to the surface, so did decades of royal conspiracy, cover-up rumors, and enough suspicious contradictions to make Sherlock Holmes cancel his weekend plans. Let's rewind. After the now notorious surprise diagnosis from people Ludwig had never even had coffee with, he was whisked off to Castle Berg, a pretty lakeside villa that had all the charm of a prison but with better wallpaper. He was under the watchful eye of Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the very psychiatrist who had declared him unfit to rule. Ludwig, as you can imagine, was not thrilled. Imagine being declared mentally unstable by a stranger, then being forced to room with them. It's like being fired, and then told your new job is babysitting your replacement. The final evening of Ludwig's life was overcast, gloomy, exactly the type of weather that practically begs for tragedy. Around 6:30 p.m., the king and his doctor went for a walk. No guards, no escort, just two men headed toward the water. You can probably guess what happened next. Hours passed, no one returned. By nightfall, a search party began combing the grounds, though you get the sense no one was exactly sprinting. Eventually, both Ludwig and Dr. von Gudden were found lifeless in the lake. The king's body, fully clothed and without signs of struggle or trauma, was floating peacefully, like a character in a painting. The doctor, however, showed signs of a struggle, bruises and a battered face. One man looked like he fell asleep in the tub. The other looked like he was auditioning for a true crime podcast. The official ruling? Suicide by drowning. A tragic end to a troubled mind. But there was one tiny problem. Ludwig was an Olympic-caliber swimmer. Okay, not literally, but the man was a powerful, avid swimmer who had spent plenty of time in lakes. The water was so shallow, a goat could probably wade through it, and yet the king supposedly drowned himself without so much as splashing around? Not buying it. Cue the conspiracy theories. Theory nub 1, murder. The most popular one. Perhaps Ludwig tried to escape, or worse, confronted the doctor and was killed during a struggle. Maybe guards got involved. Maybe there were witnesses who were conveniently silenced. Maybe the whole thing was less, oh no, he slipped, and more, sure, no one saw anything. Theory 2, suicide pact. Some suggest that Ludwig and Dr. von Gudden struck a grim agreement, but the bruises on the doctor suggest otherwise. Either he was very bad at friendly drowning, or someone else intervened. Theory scape gone wrong. This one is popular among the romantics. Ludwig plotted to flee, perhaps with the help of loyalists. The doctor caught wind of it, tried to stop him, and a struggle ensued. A tragic accident, or a not-so-accidental accident followed. Theory spore. He's still alive. A favorite among the tinfoil hat crowd. Ludwig didn't die at all. He faked his death, slipped away under the cloak of night, and spent the rest of his life building even more fabulous castles in secret. Possibly in Switzerland, or on the moon. No one's really sure. The mystery was never solved. No autopsy was performed, because apparently the 19th century was not big on forensic science. The royal family insisted on a quick burial, and witnesses were either silenced, ignored, or too afraid to say what they saw. The whole thing smelled fishier than the lake itself. Today, a cross stands in the shallow waters where the king was found, a monument not just to a life cut short, but to a mystery that refuses to sink. Tourists still flock to Lake Starnberg, snapping photos of the eerily calm waters and wondering how a man so grand, so strange, and so utterly unique could vanish under such suspiciously soggy circumstances. Ludwig II may have left behind no heirs, no military legacy, and no political triumphs, but he left us castles in the clouds, opera in the halls, and one of Europe's juiciest unsolved royal deaths. In the end, whether he was murdered, escaped, or simply gave up on a world that never understood him, one thing is certain: Ludwig didn't just build fairy tales, he became one. The year was 1406. Europe was still arguing about whether bathing was witchcraft, and China was about to embark on one of the most excessive real estate ventures in human history. This wasn't just a palace, it was a statement, and that statement was, "I'm not overcompensating, you're overcompensating." At the center of this imperial ambition stood Emperor Yongle of the Ming dynasty. Yongle didn't start out as the heir to the throne. He was the emperor's fourth son, which, in medieval royal terms, is one step above extra in the background of a tapestry. But Yongle wasn't the type to let a little thing like birth order or his older brother's existence get in the way. After a good old-fashioned civil war, aka family disagreement but with fire, Yongle claimed the throne and immediately decided the capital needed a makeover. Or, more precisely, a complete relocation. "Let's move from Nanjing to Beijing," he said. "Also, let's build a massive walled palace city filled with symbolism, splendor, and enough roof tiles to shade the moon." The Forbidden City wasn't just built to impress. It was built to intimidate. Yongle wanted to cement his rule in stone, wood, and gold. He wasn't merely constructing a new palace. He was constructing a cosmic command center where heaven met earth, and where no one else could park without permission. The idea was rooted in Confucian ideals, but let's be honest, this was also about building something so breathtaking that it left all previous emperors looking like they'd been living in sad sheds. His blueprint? A rectangle nearly a kilometer long and 3/4 of a kilometer wide, surrounded by a 26-foot high wall and a 170-foot wide moat. Because nothing says I'm approachable like a giant water hazard filled with crocodile-level vibes. Now, any normal project of this scale would be carefully planned, patiently built, and funded over decades. But Yongle wasn't a man of patience. He wanted it now, or at least within his lifetime, which meant construction had to move faster than a court eunuch, avoiding political drama. So what do you do when you want to build the largest palace complex in history in record time? You conscript over 1 million people, of course. Brickmakers, woodworkers, stone carvers, artisans, and probably a few very confused farmers were summoned from all across the empire. Giant timbers were hauled from remote southern forests. Stone was dragged from quarries over 100 kilometers away, and bricks were baked in industrial-scale kilns that turned entire provinces into smoke signals of progress. Oh, and all of this happened without cranes, power tools, or hard hats. Over the next 14 years, the city rose like an architectural phoenix out of the northern plains, if the phoenix also suffered from severe budget issues, labor shortages, and micromanagement. The cost? Let's just say Yongle's accountants probably needed therapy. The Forbidden City ate up silver like candy at a toddler's birthday party. It required 230,000 cubic meters of wood, 100,000 artisans, tens of millions of handmade bricks, gold leaf, lacquer, and an imperial obsession with red so deep it's a wonder China didn't run out of cinnabar. Environmentalists would have wept. Entire forests in Sichuan were chopped down. Stone slabs weighing tens of tons were transported over frozen roads using water poured onto the ice to reduce friction. An engineering trick that somehow worked and absolutely did not help the horses' morale. By the time it was done in 1420, Yongle had built a city within a city that was more fortress than home. Nearly 1,000 buildings, 980 surviving today, each serving a purpose that sounded either bureaucratic or unnecessarily specific. Want to burn incense? There's a hall for that. Want to meet your ministers? 2 halls for that. Want to sit quietly and contemplate life while maintaining overwhelming superiority? Oh, at least 7 pavilions for that. Yongle called it the Zijin Cheng, or Purple Forbidden City. Purple, symbolizing the North Star and heaven's will. Forbidden, because if you weren't invited you'd better turn around or risk disappearing mysteriously. City, because it literally functioned as one with its own guards, cooks, temples, and gossip network. Yongle didn't live long after its completion, but his legacy was sealed in stone, tile, and imperial extravagance. The Forbidden City would stand for over 500 years as the center of Chinese imperial power, outlasting 24 emperors, numerous invasions, and an earthquake or two. But for Yongle, it was never just about governance, it was about making a point. I won, I rule, I live here now, and good luck finding the bathroom. If you ever find yourself lost in the Forbidden City, congratulations, you've just been personally outwitted by a floor plan. This place wasn't just designed, it was orchestrated, like someone handed Confucius a compass, an imperial ego, and said, make it symmetrical enough to scare the heavens. The layout of the Forbidden City is 1 part cosmic philosophy, 1 part military-grade crowd control, and 1 part petty architectural judgment. Because yes, even the buildings silently judged you, and their placement told you exactly how important or irrelevant you were. Let's start with the core principle behind the city's layout, symmetry. Not just general balance, we're talking clinical, obsessive, soul-crushing symmetry. If you so much as built a window out of alignment, an official might show up and reassign you to brick sorting duty in Mongolia. Everything is arranged along a perfectly straight north-south axis. This central line runs through the heart of the complex, like the world's most intimidating spinal cord. stretching from the Meridian Gate at the front, all the way to the Imperial Garden at the rear. This was the path of ultimate power, the Emperor's Highway, also known as you don't walk here unless your job title starts with Son of Heaven. To the left and right of this sacred line, minor buildings, side halls, courtyards, each gradually decreasing in importance the farther they drift from the center. The closer you were to the axis, the closer you were to political relevance, and the farther you were from it. Well, enjoy the smell of horse stalls and irrelevance. It was Confucianism in architectural form. Hierarchy wasn't just practiced, it was literally built into the floor plan. The Forbidden City isn't just one palace, it's over 900 buildings, each acting like it's the main character. But not all buildings were created equal. Some were grand, throne-adorned halls with names like Hall of Supreme Harmony or Palace of Heavenly Purity, which frankly sound like scented candles but were actually bureaucratic power centers. Then you had the smaller, less glamorous spaces, waiting halls, storage pavilions, and countless rooms that existed solely so officials had somewhere to awkwardly stand around during processions. Their names were less poetic. Think Hall of Grand Restraint or Chamber of Shut Up and Wait. Even the roof tiles got in on the action. The emperor's buildings were topped with glorious yellow glazed tiles, the color of imperial authority. No one else in China was allowed to use them, not even your coolest warlord or your most ambitious local governor. Yellow meant power. Yellow meant divinity. Yellow also meant your roof was probably worth more than most people's houses. Everyone else in the palace complex got downgraded roof colors, green for libraries, blue for temples. It was basically an ancient architectural mood ring of how much the universe cared about your job description. Of course, no Chinese architectural marvel would be complete without feng shui, and the Forbidden City took it deadly seriously. This wasn't move the couch to improve your qi feng shui. This was align the throne room with the cosmos or the empire collapses feng shui. The Forbidden City was deliberately placed so that it sat at the center of Beijing, which sat at the center of the empire, which sat under the celestial authority of the North Star, the symbolic seat of heaven. The palace itself pointed south, which was considered the direction of life, warmth, and power. Even the sequence of buildings followed a cosmic logic. The outer court, where state affairs happened, was the realm of yang, masculine, powerful, rigid. The inner court, where the emperor and family lived, was yin, feminine, private, harmonious. Together they formed a cosmic balance, or at least a very awkward family dynamic with heavily guarded corridors. Entry into the Forbidden City wasn't just about crossing a threshold, it was about being evaluated at every step. The main entrance, the Meridian Gate, is the architectural equivalent of being side-eyed by a 50-foot-tall doorman. It was here that ministers assembled, waiting to be summoned or occasionally scolded publicly in a way that made 15th-century HR departments very nervous. Once inside, you had to cross 5 marble bridges representing the 5 Confucian virtues because nothing says virtue like tripping on ancient stonework in front of your superior. Then came the courtyards, massive open spaces that weren't just for aesthetics. These were intimidation chambers. You'd walk across a giant plaza toward a throne room, heat baking the stone under your feet, surrounded by silence, stone lions, and the growing realization that you definitely forgot your speech notes. That's not just architecture, that's psychological warfare. Think the architects were done yet? Not even close. They obsessed over numbers with a religious fervor. 9, being the emperor's sacred number, appears everywhere. 9 rows of nails on gates, 9 mythical beasts on roof ridges, and 999.5 rooms because legend said only heaven could have a full 1,000. Not to mention 5,000 years of symbolism crammed into every inch of wall space like history's most stressful Easter egg hunt. If you've ever felt the sting of being left off an exclusive guest list, consider this your emotional support scroll. The Forbidden City was the original You Can't Sit With Us, except instead of a high school cafeteria, it was 178 acres of royal rejection. Just looking too long at the wrong wall could earn you a one-way trip to the afterlife. No questions, no refunds, and definitely no reviews. To the outside world, the Forbidden City shimmered like a divine puzzle box, and that was the point. Its walls weren't just made to keep people out. They were designed to remind everyone that even imagining yourself inside might be a crime. Entry was a privilege so rare it made front row seats at the Super Bowl look like spare change. Access was dictated by a very clear and very terrifying hierarchy. At the top were the emperors, of course the living sons of heaven, celestial mediators between the cosmos and the chaos of earth. Directly below them were the royals, high-ranking officials and eunuchs. Then came servants, palace women, guards, and finally the bottom rung, people who didn't belong and would be escorted out by force, sword, or simply never seen again. For the everyday citizen of Imperial China, stepping inside the Forbidden City was about as likely as being struck by lightning while winning the lottery on a flying pig. The entire complex was encased in imposing vermilion walls, nearly 8 meters high and wide enough to repel dreams. Surrounding that was a deep, moat-sized reminder that no, you are not invited. Even palace workers who were granted entry couldn't stroll in casually. There were procedures, protocols, parades of paperwork, in some cases family background checks going back 3 generations. Even the pigeons, it's joked, needed an imperial ID to flap their wings near the roof. Approaching the city meant crossing an endless sequence of increasingly serious obstacles. First came the outer city, then the imperial city, and finally the Forbidden City itself, a kind of bureaucratic nesting doll designed to weed out unworthy intentions one checkpoint at a time. Think TSA security, but every gate is spiritually aligned, staffed with sword-wielding guards, and radiating 15th century judgment. The layers weren't just physical, they were social armor. Each gate served as a test. Were you ranked enough? Male enough? Culturally appropriate enough to pass through? Officials entered through specific doors based on status, time of day, and even the occasion. There were gates for civil ministers, gates for military officers, and gates that existed just to make your entrance feel appropriately stressful. If you were lucky enough to get in, chances were you'd be carefully observed by palace guards stationed at nearly every turn. These weren't your sleepy mall cops. These were elite soldiers trained to notice suspicious eye contact, a foot out of place, or the whiff of treason carried on someone's lunch. But the real gatekeepers were not the guards. It was the system. The Forbidden City ran on a strict operating model, ritual, hierarchy, and paranoia. And nowhere was this more evident than in how it managed people. Your identity defined how far you got, and how long you stayed. High-ranking ministers, for example, were only permitted in designated halls and only at designated times. They didn't pop in. They petitioned, waited, bowed, reported. Then they left the same way they came, backward, never turning their backs to the emperor, lest they risk poor posture and immediate punishment. Eunuchs, despite their servant status, had far more access. They lived in the city, served the emperor directly, and were allowed deep within the inner court. But even they were monitored closely. Surveillance was so thorough that even whispering in the wrong direction could land you in a room with a very ominous name, like the Office of Moral Conduct, which was neither moral nor conducive to your health. As for the women of the palace, entry was possible, but freedom was not. Once selected, whether as concubines, maids, or attendants, they effectively surrendered their lives to the walls. Most never saw their families again. The gates that let them in didn't always swing both ways. For many, their entire world shrank to the size of a courtyard and the ambitions of whoever outranked them. But let's not forget the absolute outsiders, foreign diplomats. Getting a meeting inside the Forbidden City was like trying to order off menu in a restaurant that only serves cosmic hierarchy. Foreign envoys were often brought in under heavily guarded circumstances, guided along specific paths designed to show grandeur while keeping secrets. In many cases, they never actually met the emperor. They just delivered tributes, bowed a lot, and left with sore knees and no clearer idea of what was really going on. To be clear, this wasn't just exclusion for the sake of vanity. It was calculated. The Forbidden City was designed to maintain the image of an unapproachable divine court. Letting commoners wander in would ruin the illusion. Heaven didn't do meet and greets. In the end, the Forbidden City was not only a place, it was a performance, and only a few got to be in the cast. The rest, well, they were the audience, kept at a healthy, respectful, and very enforced distance. You might think being Emperor of China came with all the perks: silk robes, divine titles, and an army of servants ready to pamper your every whim. But step inside the Forbidden City's inner court, and you'll discover the uncomfortable truth. Being the son of heaven was mostly a glamorous prison sentence, just with better wallpaper. From the outside, the emperor looked like the most powerful man on earth. From the inside, he was more like the world's most elaborately dressed hostage. Every moment of his life was scripted, watched, and carved into ritual. His schedule was tighter than a royal corset, and spontaneity, that was reserved for rebellions. A typical imperial morning began with a dawn wake-up call, not from an alarm clock, but from an official called the Master of the Wardrobe, a title that sounds like it should involve capes, but actually just involved lots of nervous bowing. Before the emperor had even rubbed sleep from his divine eyes, attendants had already prepared his robe, scrolls for the day's meetings, and a list of people who desperately wanted things from him. Breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was a ceremonial ordeal, supervised by a team of taste testers who bravely poked at dumplings in case one of them was laced with treason. And even if everything was safe, the emperor didn't get to eat in peace. He was observed while chewing, because nothing says good morning like 60 people watching you eat rice with historic significance. Then came audiences with ministers, formal, stiff meetings where everyone bowed more than they talked, and where the emperor pretended to listen while mentally drafting passive-aggressive decrees. The ministers would speak in carefully rehearsed phrases, designed not to offend or reveal any emotion more extreme than mild concern. Eye contact was discouraged. Smiling? Practically treason. Basically, it was like corporate HR, but with more silk and possible executions. If that sounds dull, don't worry. There were also rituals. Endless rituals. Rituals for the seasons. Rituals for the harvest. Rituals for ancestors. Rituals about rituals. Some of these involved standing outside in full regalia for hours, while priests mumbled about cosmic balance, and ministers tried not to collapse from heat stroke. These ceremonies weren't optional. As emperor, you didn't just go to rituals, you embodied them. You were the bridge between heaven and earth, which is majestic until you realize that bridges don't get to take bathroom breaks. But perhaps the most exhausting part of being emperor wasn't the workload, it was the paranoia. When you sit on a throne that dozens, maybe hundreds of people dream of stealing, your daily to-do list starts to look like a survival guide. Don't drink the wine. Don't trust the concubine. Don't walk in the garden unless your guards already cleared the bushes. Don't even sleep in the same room twice in a row. Seriously, many emperors rotated sleeping chambers like they were playing musical beds, all to confuse would-be assassins with excellent night vision. It didn't help that everyone in the palace had a political agenda. Eunuchs jockeyed for influence. Ministers plotted reforms. Concubines whispered. Family members smiled too much. The emperor was the center of the empire, but also its most isolated figure. He had access to over 9,000 rooms, yet nowhere to go for an honest conversation. You could walk for miles inside your own palace and never find someone you actually trusted. That's not just lonely, it's a lifestyle curated by existential dread. Some emperors handled this pressure with poise, others, well, did not. There were emperors who became obsessed with alchemy, convinced that mercury smoothies would grant them immortality. Spoiler, they didn't. Others retreated into hedonism, building pleasure gardens, commissioning opera performances for one-man audiences, or spending weeks hidden among their concubines playing elaborate games that no one dared interrupt. One Ming emperor even decided he'd rather be a carpenter, sneaking off to hammer furniture in secret, while the empire patiently waited for his imperial guidance. But these eccentricities weren't just signs of boredom, they were symptoms of a deeper truth. Absolute power with no outlet breeds absolute weirdness. When you can't leave your palace, can't trust your advisors, and can't confide in anyone, your hobbies start to get strange. Imagine being so powerful that your every word shapes a continent, but you can't even pick your lunch without someone turning it into a metaphor for national stability. Of course, a few emperors tried to break the mold. Some secretly disguised themselves to wander the city. Others flirted with reform. But the walls of the Forbidden City weren't built just of bricks. They were made of centuries of tradition, expectation, and ritualized pressure. Breaking out wasn't just frowned upon, it threatened the very image of celestial authority. So most emperors stayed put, physically wrapped in silk and metaphorically wrapped in bureaucracy. In the end, the Forbidden City didn't just isolate the emperor from danger, it isolated him from humanity. Surrounded by grandeur, bowed to by thousands, but emotionally marooned. The loneliest man in the empire wore gold robes and had 10,000 servants, and still no one to tell him when he had spinach in his teeth. If you thought royal life was all tiaras and tea cakes, welcome to the Forbidden City's female quarters, where the gowns were silk, the gossip was lethal, and reality was stranger than any show on streaming. Behind the crimson walls and golden rooftops of the palace complex was a world where women wielded influence with a glance, a gesture, or, if all else failed, a well-timed rumor. While the emperor sat alone on his dragon throne, a whole separate empire pulsed just out of sight, one ruled not by armies but by empresses, concubines, and the ironclad politics of powdered faces. Let's start at the top of the silk ladder, the empress. She was the first lady of the land, the mother of the nation, and depending on the dynasty, the only woman in the entire complex legally allowed to have a good day. Her job was a blend of social director, religious figurehead, and palace HR manager. She supervised the thousands of women in the inner court, presided over rituals, and occasionally helped the emperor decide who lived, who died, and who got reassigned to folding laundry in a lesser courtyard. You know, queen stuff. But while the empress might have had the title, true palace power often came from behind the throne or behind the curtain, to be specific. Enter the Empress Dowager, usually the emperor's mother, and always the woman with the sharpest mind and the sharpest cheekbones. She often took over if the emperor was too young, too incompetent, or too busy trying to breed immortal turtles. In such cases, the Dowager Empress became the de facto ruler, issuing edicts in his name and running court like a seasoned CEO with a bottomless grudge list. One such legend was Empress Dowager Cixi, who didn't just rule from the shadows. She practically built herself a spotlight. After rising from concubine to supreme matriarch, she managed the empire for nearly 5 decades. That's right. While the emperor technically had the throne, she had the power, the influence, and the killer cheekbones. Think of her as the palace's unofficial prime minister. If the prime minister also picked out the emperor's pajamas and had people exiled for chewing too loud. Now, onto the concubines, of which there were many. The emperor could have thousands depending on how ambitious or overcompensating he felt. These women were hand-picked for their beauty, elegance, and sometimes just because they had particularly symmetrical ears. But don't let the silk robes fool you. Life as a concubine was no stroll through the peony garden. Once selected, these women entered a gladiatorial arena of whispered threats, strategic gifts, and deeply suspicious tea. Rank mattered. The highest-ranking concubines had names like noble consort or virtuous lady, which roughly translated to "I'm slightly more important than the girl next to me." They had personal attendants, lived in larger quarters, and occasionally got a smile from the emperor. The lower ranks, however, spent their days hoping for a promotion, or at least not getting assigned to toilet duty. And then came the drama. Palace life for these women wasn't just about serving tea and looking wistfully at koi ponds. It was about surviving. Every evening the emperor's staff would present him with a tray of name tags, and he'd pick who he wanted to visit like it was the world's most passive-aggressive Tinder. A single night of favor could mean promotion, gifts, and a life of luxury, or, more commonly, jealousy, plots, and an eventual reassignment to the quiet wing where no one ever returned from. Concubines spied on each other, sabotaged rival outfits, and sometimes allegedly poisoned competitors. Even their food was suspect, which led many of them to keep private testers. Imagine being so mistrustful that you can't eat a dumpling without first seeing if it kills your assistant. It was less romantic palace intrigue and more Game of Thrones Jade Edition. Yet for all the backstabbing and backroom plotting, the women of the Forbidden City were not passive players. Many of them came from noble families and were highly educated. They played musical instruments, recited poetry, and were more politically astute than half the imperial council. They knew how to speak with grace, flatter with precision, and subtly destroy a reputation using nothing more than a compliment with a side of shade. Sometimes, a concubine's child would become the heir. In that moment, the mother gained a status boost so enormous it could rival the Grand Canal. Suddenly, she wasn't just Lady X. She was mother of the future emperor, and she moved up the palace hierarchy like a firecracker through a scroll rack. But for every tale of triumph, there were dozens of women who lived and died within the Forbidden City's golden cage without leaving a trace. Their names were forgotten, their stories untold, and their dramas, once all-consuming, faded into the red lacquer walls. Yet their presence shaped the empire just as much as the emperors they surrounded. So the next time someone tells you history is just about men in funny hats, remember the palace's inner court where the women wore silk, smiled politely, and plotted like their futures depended on it, because they absolutely did. If you thought the Forbidden City's halls were only filled with robe-swishing royals and suspiciously long-living empresses, you'd be tragically underestimating the real puppeteers behind the golden screens, the eunuchs. Yes, those famously castrated palace attendants who were once just supposed to serve tea and water the imperial plants somehow ended up running massive parts of the Chinese bureaucracy. It's the kind of career leap LinkedIn still dreams about. Originally, eunuchs were brought in for a very specific reason. No family, no heirs, no risk of romantic dalliances with the concubines. In the emperor's eyes, a man with no, let's say, distractions was the safest person to have around his women and his secrets. But like any institution that underestimates the power of a good organizational chart, the Ming and Qing dynasties learned the hard way. Eunuchs may have been denied the chance to father children, but they more than made up for it by birthing scandals, coups, and entire unofficial governments. At first they were humble. Picture them lighting lanterns, delivering messages, and bowing themselves into early scoliosis. But over time, as emperors came and went and some barely came at all, it was the eunuchs who remained constant. After all, they lived inside the Forbidden City. They were always nearby, always listening, always one step closer to the emperor's ear than the officials sweating it out in the outer court. Their proximity to power became their greatest weapon. Some emperors even preferred eunuch advice to that of their ministers. Why? Ministers had ambitions. Eunuchs had, well, no family to promote, no noble clan to empower, and no legacy to leave behind, or so everyone thought. Take, for instance, Wei Zhongshan, the Beyoncé of corrupt eunuchs during the late Ming dynasty. This man went from scrubbing floors to essentially running the empire. He controlled court appointments, exiled anyone who disagreed with him, and even commissioned temples to worship himself. Subtlety was not his strong suit. In today's terms, he'd be the guy who printed his own face on the currency and still demanded a bonus. The system encouraged this. Eunuchs could read and write, they were often better educated than the average official, and crucially, they weren't bound by Confucian morality codes that made everyone else hesitate. The Confucian ideal said officials should be virtuous and loyal. Eunuchs said, virtue is overrated, I've got palace keys and dirt on everyone. Of course, their power wasn't just granted, it was cultivated. Empress dowagers often used eunuchs as their trusted go-betweens, especially when the court was dominated by rival male factions. A savvy eunuch could play both sides, carrying gossip in one hand and forged edicts in the other. In an empire built on hierarchy and ritual, these men knew how to bend rules without breaking them until, of course, they did break them, with devastating results. And let's not forget their unofficial role as royal intelligence agents. Eunuchs were everywhere, guarding doorways, delivering meals, recording conversations. If you whispered a complaint about the emperor's robe looking like a bad wallpaper pattern, chances are a eunuch already had it on a scroll and delivered it with a bow. In many ways, they were the palace's human surveillance system, with less subtlety and more silken robes. But for all their power, their lives weren't exactly enviable. Their identities were reduced to their utility. Their social status was forever ambiguous, and their fates were often tied directly to the ruler they served. When the emperor died or was overthrown, many eunuchs met, let's call them career-ending outcomes. Retirement plans didn't exist, neither did mercy. Ironically, the very thing that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. As convenient scapegoats for political failures, they were frequently blamed for everything from imperial decline to bad weather. Some historians say they hastened the fall of dynasties. Others argue they merely reflected the corruption already baked into the system. Either way, they were the palace's ultimate paradox, powerless men who wielded absolute power. In many ways, eunuchs became the empire's living contradiction, symbolizing purity and service, while secretly running the backroom deals and scandalous plots. The Forbidden City was supposed to be the realm of the divine emperor, but more often than not it was the eunuch whispering behind the throne who decided who ate, who rose, and who suddenly tripped into a mysterious exile. If you ever feel like your house creaks too much at night, spare a thought for the poor souls patrolling the Forbidden City, where the creaks weren't always wood and the shadows weren't always furniture. The world's largest imperial palace complex also moonlighted as China's spookiest haunted mansion, with nearly 600 years of plots, tragic ends and suspicious disappearances stuffed into over 900 buildings. It's no surprise that the Forbidden City developed a ghost problem, or as imperial court records might phrase it, an accumulation of lingering energies of deceased former residents who died with unresolved grievances. To call the Forbidden City haunted is like saying the ocean is a bit damp. There are entire corridors that even today remain off-limits at night. Not for safety reasons, but because nobody wants to be the one who runs into the headless lady in red. Yes, that's one of the palace's most infamous spectres, a ghostly woman in a flowing crimson robe, floating soundlessly down palace walkways in search of her long-lost head. Apparently, if you're going to be a restless spirit, you might as well do it in dramatic fashion. Other reports over the centuries have mentioned disembodied footsteps echoing down empty halls, sudden chills in otherwise warm rooms, and lights flickering where there were no torches or lanterns. Some guards claimed they'd hear low whispers, spoken in the ancient dialects of past dynasties, despite being the only living soul in the building. It's the kind of place where you definitely second-guess your night shift assignment. But the spooky ambiance wasn't just about wandering phantoms. The imperial court was absolutely obsessed with avoiding bad omens and supernatural wrath. Every architectural decision, every room's layout, every ceremonial schedule, everything had to be cleared with a cosmologist, feng shui master, or imperial astrologer. If Mercury was in retrograde, no one dared even change the cushions on the emperor's dragon throne. Okay, not quite, but it's not far off. Feng shui wasn't just home decor advice in the Forbidden City, it was the literal design manual. The complex was built with meticulous attention to spiritual harmony. North-facing gates, southern exposure, symmetrical walls, and auspicious courtyards weren't just for aesthetics. They were there to guide good fortune in and keep malevolent spirits out, or in many cases, keep them stuck inside and hopefully confined to the lesser hallways. The emperor's personal quarters, for example, were flanked by protective symbols, like stone lions, mythical beasts, and screens to confuse wandering ghosts. Because naturally, spirits can fly through walls but get stumped by decorative wooden panels. Logic was a casual casualty when superstition was involved, and don't think for a second that all this paranoia was limited to the Ming era. Qing emperors continued the tradition of ghost-proofing everything. In fact, some emperors became so obsessed with omens that entire military campaigns were delayed because a turtle sneezed during a celestial reading. Alright, not literally, but you get the vibe. They were serious about this stuff. Astrologers played a massive role in daily court life. These weren't quirky old guys peering at stars with a brass telescope. They were highly respected, sometimes feared. Members of the inner court, whose job it was to interpret everything from solar eclipses to unexpected bird behavior. If a comet passed overhead, there was a solid chance someone in the court was getting fired, exiled, or gently poisoned. As for rituals, oh, the rituals. The palace performed an annual laundry list of ceremonies meant to chase away misfortune. Bells were rung to purify the air. Talismanic scrolls were hung in doorways. In some cases, entire altars were built for the express purpose of telling ghostly residents, please leave, or at least keep the moaning down after midnight. Even food preparation wasn't exempt from spiritual micromanagement. Certain meals were considered unlucky during specific times of year. Entire kitchens were ritually cleansed if a bad omen had occurred near the stove. And let's not forget offerings. Platters of symbolic foods left out not for visitors, but for the invisible tenants of the afterlife, just in case they were feeling peckish. Today, the Forbidden City is one of the most visited museums in the world. But even now, staff and visitors alike whisper about eerie experiences after dark. Some security guards rotate shifts so that no one spends too much time alone in the same building. Others claim they've seen shadows move without cause, or heard faint crying from behind locked doors. Maybe it's all just the echo of history. Maybe it's the product of an overactive imagination fueled by centuries of superstition and rumor. Or maybe, just maybe, when you pack thousands of years of ambition, heartbreak, rivalry, and betrayal into one palace, a few spirits decide to stick around. For 5 centuries, the Forbidden City was the definition of elite. It was the ultimate gated community, except the gates were red-lacquered, towered, and watched by enough guards to staff a small nation. But eventually, even the most immovable empires run into something stronger, the passage of time and a whole lot of revolution. The imperial iron grip on China began to loosen in the early 20th century, and with it, the once untouchable Forbidden City started preparing for its strangest transformation yet. From royal residence to public museum, spoiler alert, it didn't go quietly. Let's start with the man who got to experience both worlds. Puyi, the last emperor of China, and possibly the most awkward teenager to ever rule an empire. He was just 2 years old when he was declared the son of heaven in 1908. That's right, toddler tantrums were suddenly state affairs. Of course, being emperor wasn't quite what it used to be. By the time Puyi was old enough to hold a spoon without supervision, the real decisions were already being made by advisors and court factions, with more experience and considerably fewer juice stains. Fast forward to 1912, and things went from shaky to revolutionary. The Xinhai Revolution brought down the Qing dynasty, ending more than 2 millennia of imperial rule. You'd expect that to come with dramatic consequences: torches, pitchforks, angry mobs storming the palace gates. But instead, something far weirder happened. Puyi was allowed to stay. Yes, the revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, but gave the former emperor a lease deal. They let him live in the Forbidden City like a royal squatter, as long as he didn't try to run the country again. It was the world's politest coup. So there Puyi remained, China's answer to a deposed CEO still lingering around the office, awkwardly pretending to be useful while everyone else tries to move on. His rule post-abdication was essentially ceremonial cosplay. He continued to dress in emperor robes, held mock rituals, and still had a fleet of eunuchs, concubines, and servants who treated him as if nothing had changed. Only everything had changed. But even cosplay comes with an expiration date. By 1924, a warlord named Feng Yuxiang finally gave Puyi the royal boot. Feng marched in, declared the palace state property, and told the last emperor to pack up his robes and head out. Suddenly, the Forbidden City wasn't so forbidden anymore. The place that once needed an imperial bloodline, 1,000 titles, and possibly a small army to get into, was flung open to the public. One day it was an emperor's sanctuary. The next, it was the hottest ticket in town for tourists, scholars, and curious Beijingers who wanted to see what all the fuss had been about for the last 500 years. Naturally, it wasn't exactly move-in ready. The Forbidden City, while opulent, was also stuck in a strange limbo. Years of neglect, political chaos, and the occasional looting spree had left its 9,000 rooms in need of some serious TLC. Furniture disappeared, priceless artifacts went missing, and several buildings were one strong breeze away from being a pile of poetic rubble. But hey, what's a little structural decay compared to centuries of exclusivity? Still, the idea of walking through the same halls that emperors once paced in fear and paranoia had undeniable appeal. Visitors came by the thousands, their feet treading the same stones where royal slippers once glided. The thrones were roped off, the grand halls echoed with chatter instead of ceremonial silence, and the pigeons, finally free from background checks, roamed with impunity. As for Puyi, his life after the palace was a mixed bag of surreal detours. He tried to become emperor again twice, actually. Once with Japanese backing in Manchukuo, not his best move, and later as a puppet figure. Eventually, he was captured by the Soviets, spent years in prison, underwent re-education, and finally settled into civilian life as a humble gardener in Beijing. From emperor to museum exhibit to bonsai trimmer, Puyi's life arc could make a Shakespeare play feel underwhelming. Meanwhile, the Forbidden City continued its own transformation, restored, preserved, and reborn as the Palace Museum. It became one of the most visited cultural sites on Earth. The place that once symbolized ultimate inaccessibility now welcomed millions annually. The marble walkways, once trod only by dragons and nervous officials, now hosted selfie sticks, souvenir stands, and snack carts selling imperial-themed popsicles. Somewhere a Qing emperor was spinning in his jade tomb. And yet the mystique remained. Even as it opened its doors, the Forbidden City never quite lost its aura of grandeur, its heavy silence, or its whispering corners. Because no matter how many tour groups march through its gates, there's something about the place that still feels like it's watching you, judging your wardrobe, silently measuring your worth against centuries of impossible standards. The Forbidden City, once a labyrinth of power, paranoia, and polished protocol, is now home to a new empire, tourists, millions of them. Every year, around 14 million people shuffle, snap, and selfie their way through what was once the most exclusive real estate in China. Where once only the emperor's embroidered slippers dared tread, now flip-flops, digital cameras, and matching tour group caps abound. After the imperial system collapsed in 1912 and the last emperor Puyi was evicted like a tenant who overstayed his dynasty, the Forbidden City underwent a serious identity crisis. For centuries it was the epicenter of Chinese political life, but suddenly it was unemployed, unstaffed, and open to interpretation. In 1925, it was rebranded as the Palace Museum, proving that even palaces can get a second act and a decent marketing team. Today, it's one of the world's most visited museums and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an ironic twist considering that it was literally built to keep the public out. The same city that once executed anyone who dared wander in now has ticket booths, multilingual maps, and rest areas. There are lines where assassins once plotted, vending machines where secret edicts were whispered, and yes, gift shops where concubines once fought for influence. But transforming a 720,000 square meter imperial stronghold into a museum isn't as simple as dusting off a few dragon statues and calling it a day. The place has nearly 1,000 buildings, 8,700 rooms, and more wooden structures than a suburban Home Depot. Preserving it is like maintaining an ancient scroll made of architecture, except it's constantly exposed to sunlight, footsteps, and the occasional enthusiastic tourist licking something they really shouldn't. Restoration efforts are meticulous and never-ending. Entire teams of historians, conservators, and architects work year-round to repair, reinforce, and research every tile, beam, and mythical beast carving. There are even experts dedicated just to restoring the color of the walls, because the imperial red must look precisely divinely intimidating. And let's not even talk about the roof tiles. Each yellow tile had a symbolic purpose, and replacing a cracked one requires more bureaucracy than a royal wedding. Despite all this, the Forbidden City remains breathtaking, not just for its scale and history, but for the absurdity of it all. Visitors can walk through the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and imagine an emperor nervously sweating through a ritual in front of hundreds of officials. They can stand in the courtyards where the Empress Dowager Kixi once maneuvered court politics like a chess grandmaster with a grudge. They can gaze into ornate throne rooms that once determined the fate of nations and now serve as elaborate photo backdrops for people in rented imperial cosplay. And with modern China's complex relationship with its past, the Forbidden City isn't just a tourist attraction, it's a symbol, a reminder of cultural endurance, imperial grandeur, and the astonishing fact that we're still trying to figure out how to tell its story without accidentally whitewashing or redwashing its history. Of course, no visit is complete without a stampede of fellow tourists. During peak seasons, the Forbidden City feels less like a tranquil historical site and more like a royal-themed marathon. There are elbows-in-your-face tour guides wielding colored flags like war standards, and an unspoken race to get the best throne room selfie before someone's umbrella stabs you in the ribs. The emperors may be gone, but the chaos remains, just in a more camera-friendly form, and in true 21st century fashion, there's an app for it. Visitors can take virtual tours, scan QR codes to learn about ancient ceramics, and listen to audio guides narrating tales of love, betrayal, and roof maintenance. It's history reimagined for the generation, because nothing says timeless cultural artifact like a boomerang video of a Ming vase. Yet, for all the modern bells, whistles, and bathroom facilities, the Forbidden City hasn't lost its gravitas. Walk through the Meridian Gate, past the moat, across the stone bridges, and into the vast courtyards, and you still feel it, that weird blend of majesty and mystery. You can almost hear the echoes of court announcements, the clack of embroidered shoes, and maybe, just maybe, the rustle of a ghost robe drifting through the rafters. It may no longer be forbidden, but it hasn't forgotten, and as China's modern skyline continues to evolve around it, this massive slice of the past reminds us that empires crumble, crowds come and go, and yet some places still refuse to be anything less than awe-inspiring. Imagine waking up one morning, stepping out your front door, and instead of hearing the familiar hum of traffic, you're greeted by the echo of hooves, the rustle of desert wind, and the smell of sun-baked sandstone. Welcome to Petra, the ancient city where your front porch is a canyon and your driveway might be a camel. If Las Vegas had a historical cousin with actual class and a bit more sand in its shoes, this would be it. Tucked away in the dusty folds of southern Jordan, Petra isn't just a place, it's a performance. And the show starts long before you see a single carved pillar. Your ticket? The Psyche, a narrow, mile-long sandstone slot canyon that practically forces you to embrace drama. It's like Mother Nature's red carpet, winding, towering, and just claustrophobic enough to make you wonder if your travel insurance covers crushed by timeless beauty. And just when your feet start to question the life choices that brought you into a crack in the earth, the canyon flares open like a curtain lifting on a stage. And there it is, Al-Khazneh, the treasury. Petra's most iconic building, smugly photogenic and bathed in rose-red stone. It doesn't just appear, it reveals itself in a way that feels more like a cinematic mic drop than architecture. You don't see Petra, you behold it. Built sometime around the 1st century AD, the treasury is the Beyoncé of ruins. It dominates every postcard, influencer reel, and travel documentary, with its towering columns, detailed friezes, and overall we get it, your majestic vibe. It's hard to believe it was originally a tomb, allegedly for a Nabatean king. But try explaining that to modern tourists who still think it's where Indiana Jones found the Holy Grail. Spoiler, it's not. Now, let's talk geography, because Petra wasn't carved into just any old rock. No, the Nabateans, those ancient desert geniuses, chose a location that was equal parts beautiful and defensive. Nestled between rugged mountains and protected by twisting canyons, Petra was practically designed to yell, "You shall not pass," to invading armies. The Jordanian desert around it is as unforgiving as it is breathtaking. Think Mars. If Mars had better architecture and significantly more goats, this harsh terrain made Petra both hidden and protected. From the West's point of view, Petra was the world's best-kept architectural secret. After the fall of the Nabatean kingdom and the city's gradual decline under Roman and Byzantine rule, Petra essentially ghosted history. Local Bedouins knew of its existence, of course, but they weren't exactly sending out postcards. Enter Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, the Swiss explorer who rediscovered Petra for the Western world in 1812, disguised as an Arab traveler, and honestly, living his best cosplay life. Burckhardt tricked a local guide into taking him to see the mysterious ruins, claiming he wanted to make a sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, Moses' brother. What he really wanted: a front-row seat to history. What he got: the bragging rights of a lifetime and the eternal gratitude of archaeologists, travel bloggers and Instagrammers alike. But Petra's lost city status wasn't just about geography, it was about perception. To European minds steeped in biblical maps and ancient Roman grandeur, Petra didn't exist until someone in a waistcoat and uncomfortable boots said it did. And while Burckhardt was the first modern Westerner to document Petra, the truth is, Petra never disappeared, it just stopped sending out RSVPs. Yet that long absence from global attention only added to its mystique. When you first walk into Petra, there's a sense of having stumbled into a forgotten world, one preserved in rose-colored stone, shaded by cliffs and guarded by time. It's like Petra was waiting for just the right moment to make its grand entrance again. And now she's not just back, she's a full-blown star. Red carpets, spotlights, the whole works. So what do we make of this ancient city that spent centuries hiding in plain sight, only to become one of the most photographed, visited, and iconic places on Earth? Well, you could say Petra is proof that good things come to those who wait quietly, in a canyon, for over 1,000 years. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how this magnificent metropolis of stone functioned, thrived, fell into decline, and rose again as a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and really ambitious rock carving. But for now, just take in that first moment, that cinematic walk through the sick, that sudden reveal of the treasury, and remember, some places don't just welcome you, they perform for you. And Petra's been rehearsing her entrance for centuries. If you ever look at Petra and think, wow, someone must have had a lot of free time and an industrial strength chisel, you're not wrong. Welcome to the world of the Nabateans, a civilization that took one look at the harsh Jordanian desert and said, yes, this is perfect for carving a city directly into the cliffs. These weren't your average desert dwellers. The Nabateans were the architects of the impossible, blending artistry, practicality, and a flair for the dramatic. While most ancient cultures were content stacking stones on top of each other, the Nabateans went full-throttle Michelangelo on mountainsides. If other cities were built, Petra was revealed, one hammer strike at a time. The Nabateans were originally nomadic Arab tribes who drifted into the area around the 4th century BCE. But instead of keeping with the whole wandering through the desert forever theme, they decided to put down roots into literal sandstone. Though not much is known about their earliest years, they weren't big on self-promotional literature. By the time the 2nd century BCE rolled around, the Nabateans were living their best desert lives. Petra had become their capital, and what a capital it was, grand, hidden, and just inconvenient enough to deter raiders, but perfect for anyone with a well-packed caravan and a flair for the dramatic. And speaking of caravans, Petra wasn't just a pretty face, it was a trade empire in a toga, sitting at the crossroads of spice, silk, incense, and probably more myrrh than anyone reasonably needed. The Nabateans turned Petra into an ancient Wall Street with camels. They controlled critical routes between Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean. Their knowledge of terrain combined with clever alliances and what must have been amazing Yelp reviews from other traders allowed them to tax, trade, and thrive. This influx of wealth funded their obsession with rock carving, bath building, and let's show the Romans we can out-Greek the Greeks' architecture. And while most desert cities were struggling to keep the sand out of their teeth, the Nabateans had imported wines, Greek amphorae, and art styles from as far away as Alexandria. Think of them as desert hipsters, eclectic, worldly, and just a little bit smug about it. A walk through Petra is like flipping through an architectural magazine from every known empire, with the Nabateans as the editors. Corinthian columns? Check. Egyptian obelisks? Check. Aramaic inscriptions? Assyrian flourishes and Mediterranean mosaics? Triple check. But this wasn't just a chaotic design spree. The Nabateans blended these styles into a unique aesthetic cocktail that still looks fresh 2,000 years later. Imagine if Indiana Jones stepped into a building that screamed Greece meets Vegas meets spiritual desert minimalism, and you've got the vibe. Their structures weren't only artistic but shockingly functional. Temples weren't just pretty, they were acoustically precise. Theaters weren't just stone benches, they hosted real performances. And the tombs, oh the tombs. If you're going to spend eternity anywhere, a multi-story cliffside mausoleum with sculpted friezes and killer views isn't a bad gig. But architecture wasn't their only flex. The Nabateans were also water management savants. And if you've never tried surviving a Jordanian summer, let's just say this skill was non-negotiable. They created an elaborate hydraulic system of dams, cisterns, aqueducts, and gravity-fed pipes that caught every precious drop of rain. While other civilizations prayed for rain, the Nabateans trapped it, stored it, and channeled it into gardens, pools, and even public fountains in the middle of the desert. This wasn't just survival, it was luxury engineering. They brought water to the rocks and life to the city, and they did it with no electricity, no digital measuring tools, and certainly no municipal budget. Just patience, precision, and an unhealthy obsession with sandstone. For a civilization with no standing army, no major conquests, and no great literary epics to their name, the Nabateans punched well above their historical weight. Their legacy is literally carved into the face of the earth. Not bad for a group that started off wandering the desert with a few camels and a solid understanding of supply and demand. And let's face it, their sense of style still outshines most modern cities. Petra wasn't just a capital, it was a statement piece, a manifesto that said, even in the desert, beauty thrives. So the next time you see a building and think, this is nice, ask yourself, can I carve it into a cliff with nothing but a hammer and a dream? If not, well, the Nabateans still win. Petra might look like the kind of place where you drop your canteen, panic, and start licking sandstone for hydration. But the reality is far more sophisticated and a lot wetter. Despite its dramatic sun-blasted setting in the arid mountains of southern Jordan, this ancient city was less thirst trap and more aquatic miracle. The Nabateans didn't just survive in the desert, they brought their own plumbing. Think less desperate oasis and more luxury spa with some serious sand in the foyer. Let's get one thing straight, Petra should not exist, not in the way it does. Its surrounding region is dry, rocky, and often hotter than a poorly ventilated oven. Yet somehow, this city of pink cliffs and stone facades became a flourishing urban center with gardens, fountains, and water features that would make even the Romans go, wait, how'd you do that? The answer? Engineering wizardry. And not the kind with wands, though honestly, it may as well have been. The Nabateans were the kind of people who looked at a barren cliff and thought, that'll hold a water tank. Their survival strategy was part genius, part paranoia, and entirely practical. They built a complex system of dams, aqueducts, and hidden cisterns that turned Petra into a veritable desert oasis, just one where everything, including your bathtub, was carved directly into stone. While other civilizations were sacrificing goats to appease the rain gods, the Nabateans were out there redirecting flash floods like seasoned hydro engineers. Petra's secret weapon was geography. Its natural canyons, especially the Sick, weren't just scenic entranceways perfect for a dramatic entrance. They also served as stormwater funnels. During seasonal rains, flash floods would come barreling through these gorges with the energy of a toddler on a sugar high. Rather than letting their city get washed away like a poorly parked chariot, the Nabateans installed dams and diversion channels that redirected the water into a sophisticated network of reservoirs. In short, they didn't stop the flood, they politely asked it to fill the bathtub first. This stored water was their lifeline. Cisterns hidden within the rock ensured that the water didn't just disappear after a week of good weather. They plastered the insides to keep leakage low and made sure they had lids or coverings to prevent evaporation. This wasn't just about drinking water either. It supported agriculture, industry, and even decorative fountains. You heard that right, fountains. These people had the audacity to build water features in a desert. That's like installing an ice rink in the Sahara. The cleverest part, much of Petra's water system was invisible. Pipes and channels were often carved directly into the cliffs or hidden behind ornate facades, giving the city an air of effortless magic. One minute you're standing in front of a dry-looking rock wall, and the next you're realizing that behind it lies a water conduit capable of keeping a small village hydrated. Petra was less look at this reservoir and more guess what's behind door number sandstone. Their water control wasn't just a convenience, it was their superpower. Water meant agriculture, agriculture meant food, and food meant trade. And trade, that's where Petra really made its money. Caravans crossing the Arabian desert didn't just stop at Petra because it was pretty, they stopped because they were thirsty. Their camels were tired, and Petra had something every desert traveler dreams of: shade, snacks, and hydration. In many ways, Petra's water system was its real treasure, more valuable than any of the ornate tombs or glittering spices passing through its markets. But this infrastructure wasn't just about human comfort. It was also a key part of Petra's urban planning. The Nabateans laid out their city with water access in mind, ensuring that even the higher elevations of the city were serviced. Gravity-fed pipes carried water from distant springs and reservoirs, using elevation as a silent ally. It was practical, it was elegant, and above all, it worked. Even today, archaeologists are still finding elements of this aquatic system buried beneath centuries of sediment. Some channels still work, others are partially collapsed, but their intentions are clear. Someone a couple thousand years ago really wanted to make sure their grapes got watered. It's humbling, really. Most modern cities struggle with water management. Petra nailed it with stone tools. So while tourists may gasp in awe at the towering treasury or snap selfies in front of elaborately carved tombs, they're often standing right above or beside the real miracle of Petra, a hidden network of aqueducts, cisterns, and channels that let an entire city thrive where logic said it shouldn't. If you're ever stranded in a desert and wondering how to survive, the Nabateans have a simple answer: bring chisels. Lots of them. Imagine standing in a vast, sun-soaked canyon, wind sweeping through the carved facades, and the smell of ancient commerce still lingering in the sandstone. Petra wasn't just pretty rockwork and impressive tombs. It was a finely tuned economic machine wrapped in rose-red stone. If the Silk Road were a blockbuster film, Petra would be the dramatic, scene-stealing supporting character that gets its own spin-off. Because Petra wasn't built for retirement, it was built for business. Let's rewind a few millennia. You're a spice trader hauling precious frankincense or myrrh across endless dunes, parched lips cracking under the brutal sun. Suddenly, like a mirage that forgot to fade, Petra appears, a literal city carved from the canyon itself, where Nabatean merchants aren't just waiting, they've prepared a 5-star logistical hub. You and your camels get water, shade, and probably a slightly overpriced tent to rest in. Meanwhile, your goods are carefully weighed, taxed, and resold in a different direction, and you're happy to pay because the alternative is dying of thirst somewhere in a featureless dune field. Petra's genius was all about location, taxation, perfectly nestled between Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. It became the arterial heart of ancient trade. Northbound caravans heading toward Damascus, westbound traders aiming for Alexandria, eastbound routes extending toward Persia and India, and Petra was there to cash in on all of them. This wasn't some sleepy desert outpost, it was a bustling cosmopolitan boomtown, and every merchant crossing the sands knew that Petra was the place where deals happened, spices flowed, and camels sighed in relief. Now let's talk incense. No, not the gentle yoga class kind, but the hot ticket item of the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just pleasant-smelling accessories. They were religious essentials, medical treatments, and royal gifts. Think of them as the Bitcoin of their day, volatile, valuable, and prone to being hoarded. The incense trade routes snaked from southern Arabia all the way up to the Mediterranean. And guess which smug little city sat right at the crossroads? That's right, Petra, the desert's toll booth. The Nabateans taxed these trade goods with the kind of precision that would make modern customs officers weep with envy. But Petra wasn't just hoarding wealth, it was soaking up culture like a sandstone sponge. As traders passed through, they didn't just bring silk and spices, they brought ideas, gods, art, and architecture. That's why Petra's cityscape is a glorious mashup of styles. Egyptian obelisks, check. Greco-Roman columns, you bet. Mesopotamian motifs? Absolutely. The Nabateans weren't just open to influence, they curated it. Their temples, tombs, and public buildings are like an ancient Pinterest board that merged the aesthetic tastes of half the known world. And let's not forget the people. Petra was home to a population as varied as its art. Nabatean elites, Arab merchants, foreign craftsmen, possibly even the occasional Roman vacationer, though probably more toga, less sunscreen, multilingual and multi-ethnic. The city thrived as a cultural blender long before globalization was a buzzword. You could walk through a Petra marketplace and hear a half-dozen languages as incense wafted from stalls and silk fluttered in the dry breeze. It was loud, fragrant, chaotic, and very, very profitable. But here's the kicker. Petra managed to pull this off without an empire's military might. The Nabateans weren't known for massive armies or conquest. They were the ancient equivalent of economic influencers, diplomatic, resourceful, and always ready to make a deal. When Rome finally annexed their kingdom in 106 CE, it wasn't through conquest but bureaucracy. That's how smooth Petra operated, when your neighbors are wielding swords and you're wielding spreadsheets. So yes, Petra was beautiful, but more importantly, it was efficient. Beneath the rose-colored stone was a money-making machine, lubricated by incense and camel spit, staffed by shrewd Nabatean minds who knew that if you control the trade routes, you control the world, or at least you can afford really good sandals. If you've ever looked at a mountain and thought, you know what would look great in that? A 130-foot-tall temple facade. Then congratulations, you're either an ancient Nabatean architect or someone in need of a chisel and a very long vacation. Because in Petra, architecture wasn't built onto the landscape. It was the landscape. No bricks, no cranes, no under-construction signs for 12 years. Just pick a cliff, grab some tools, and go full Michelangelo. If Michelangelo had traded frescoes for jackhammers and sand in his sandals, let's start with Petra's diva of design, the treasury, or as the locals call it, Al-Hazna. Standing at the end of the sick and narrow winding gorge that's already dramatic enough to deserve a drum roll, you suddenly come face to face with this towering masterpiece carved straight into rose-pink rock. And no, it wasn't actually used to store treasure. Sorry, Indiana Jones fans. The name was slapped on much later thanks to a legend about hidden riches. In reality, it was most likely a royal tomb, or the world's fanciest reminder not to skimp on your funeral budget. But semantics aside, the treasury is a jaw-dropper. Corinthian columns, intricate friezes and sculptures of eagles, gods, and floral motifs adorn its two-tiered facade. The Nabateans were flexing hard here, borrowing bits of Greek and Roman architectural flair and mixing them with local symbols like Isis, mythological guardians, and probably a few design choices that screamed, "Let's outdo Athens and make it pink." And the kicker? It wasn't constructed, it was carved from the top down. One miscalculation and boom, your grand temple becomes a lopsided cave. But wait, there's more. Like a magician saving their best trick for last, Petra pulls out the monastery ad Dir, a monumental structure perched high above the city and requiring nearly 800 rock-cut steps to reach. Call it the original Stairmaster workout, bigger than the treasury and arguably even more dramatic. The monastery's 150-foot wide facade is less ornate but even more imposing. Imagine a Roman temple that ran off into the desert to find itself, grew a beard, and came back buff and solemn. That's ad dear. So why all the showmanship? Because in Petra, visibility was everything. Most of these grand structures weren't buried in the city's center. They were on the cliffs, visible from near and far, silently announcing, yes, this is our rock. Yes, we made it fabulous. The city functioned as a literal sculpture garden, where the medium was geology, and the artists were absolute maniacs with hammers. Beyond the blockbusters of the treasury and monastery, Petra is littered with architectural bravado. The city boasts over 600 tombs, many with elaborate facades that look like Greco-Roman temples had a baby with desert sandstone. Some have carved staircases that go nowhere, purely for aesthetic flair, because if you're carving your house out of a cliff, why not add decorative nonsense? And then there's the theatre, because yes, Petra had theatrical ambition. Dug directly into the side of the mountain, the Petra Theatre could seat over 8,000 spectators. That's not a typo. 8,000. You could stage tragedies, comedies, or just loud arguments about incense prices in front of a crowd rivaling a modern stadium. And once again, no need for scaffolding. Just bring a chisel and enough patience to dig tiered seating out of solid rock. Even Petra's homes followed the if it's not carved it doesn't count rule. Many Nabateans lived in cozy rock-cut residences that today resemble minimalist apartments with very aggressive natural insulation. Think cave cheek with a side of sand. Add in temples, dining halls, altars, and even entire ceremonial complexes, all cut into the living stone, and you start to wonder whether anyone in Petra ever saw a brick and just laughed. But what's most remarkable is how seamlessly Petra blended styles. This wasn't cultural confusion, it was architectural fusion. The Nabateans borrowed from the best: Egyptian obelisks, Hellenistic facades, Roman column orders, and local Bedouin rock art, all mashed together into something uniquely Petrian. Each structure was a declaration: we've seen the world and now we've carved it. Ultimately, Petra's architecture wasn't just about housing the living or honoring the dead. It was a message etched into the mountain itself. We're here, we matter, and we'll outlast you all. And to be fair, most of it has. While empires rose and fell, the treasury still stands, the monastery still looms, and thousands of tombs still whisper the stories of a civilization that decided cliffs were just blank canvases, waiting for a little desert flair. Petra had a curious philosophy when it came to death. If you're going out, you better do it in style. Forget plain headstones or modest mausoleums. This was a city where the tombs were carved like luxury condos, framed in towering cliffs and designed to scream, "Yes, I'm dead, but did you see my front entrance?" In Petra, the afterlife wasn't just a spiritual concern, it was a full-blown architectural statement. The city's most flamboyant neighborhood wasn't the one where the markets bustled or the public speeches were made. It was Facade Street, a glorious mile-long runway of death that made even the most stoic visitor pause and mutter, "Okay, this is extra," stretching out along the cliffside like the red carpet event of the necropolis world. This thoroughfare was lined with some of Petra's grandest tombs, each one uniquely styled, dramatically towering and suspiciously more ornate than many people's living arrangements. And these weren't just for anybody. Oh no, these rock-carved beauties were the resting places of the Nabatean elite. Kings, nobles, priests, and those who had the kind of money that let you say, "Yes, I'll take the one with Corinthian columns and a view of the canyon, please." The royal tombs in particular were jaw-dropping. The urn tomb, for example, looked like someone had fused a Roman temple with a cliff and sprinkled a bit of divine ego on top. It was said to be the final resting place of King Malichus II, although, like many tombs in Petra, its actual occupant is still up for historical debate. But when your tomb has a 20-meter-high facade, the specifics seem almost beside the point. The Silk Tomb, true to its name, practically glows with swirling reds, yellows and pinks in the rock like nature's attempt at marbling. And the Corinthian tomb, imagine a rock face trying to cosplay as the Pantheon in Rome but with the flair of a desert deity. These monuments weren't just designed to honor the dead. They were crafted to impress the living and probably to trigger some intense tomb envy from passers-by. But behind the grandeur lay something even more fascinating, a belief system deeply tied to honor, memory, and cosmic visibility. The Nabateans didn't just build fancy graves because they had the tools and time. They built them because they believed remembrance was power. To be seen was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to live on. So these tombs weren't just memorials, they were metaphysical billboards broadcasting status into eternity. Every column, pediment, and decorative flourish was a coded message. This person mattered. Interestingly, not all tombs looked the same, and that was very much the point. Unlike the cookie-cutter graveyards of later civilizations, Petra's necropolis was personalized. Some tombs were cut high into cliffs, accessible only by perilous paths, reserved for those with social altitude as well as literal altitude. Others hugged the main pathways, designed to catch the eye of every traveler and trader passing through the city. Each architectural decision reflected not only the wealth of the deceased, but also their spiritual aspirations. In Nabatean culture, death wasn't just an end, it was a stage, and the tomb was your curtain call. Yet for all their visibility and extravagance, these tombs still hold an aura of mystery. Many of the interiors are simple, perhaps even stark. The grandeur, it seems, was reserved for the public-facing side, the facade that faced the world. Behind the elaborate columns and intricate carvings often lay a quiet, empty chamber. This contrast is almost poetic, a loud declaration of life on the outside, and a humble acceptance of death within. Petra's tombs weren't just marvels of engineering, they were reflections of a culture that merged vanity with spirituality, aesthetics with metaphysics. They carved their grief into rock and their ambition into eternity, and while the city's inhabitants have long since turned to dust, their grave markers remain silent, stoic, and still turning heads. So next time you pass a modest cemetery and think, well, that's tasteful, remember Petra. Here, dying wasn't the end of your real estate portfolio. It was the moment you upgraded. In 106 AD, Rome did what Rome did best. It arrived uninvited, took over everything, and added columns. That's exactly what happened to Petra when the mighty Nabatean kingdom, once the Beyonce of desert trade empires, suddenly found itself absorbed into the sprawling real estate portfolio of Emperor Trajan. No dramatic battle, no fiery last stand, just a bureaucratic shrug, a change of flags and a few architects rolling in with measuring tools and the urgent desire to modernize everything. Officially, Petra became part of the Roman province of Arabia Petrea, and like any new landlord with a flair for marble, Rome wasted no time in redecorating. The city had once been a uniquely Nabatean blend of Arab desert practicality and architectural swagger, but the Romans had a very particular taste, namely, can we make it look more Roman? Cue the colonnaded streets, Roman baths, temples with proper pediments, and the kind of urban planning that involved lots of straight lines and public forums. One of the clearest signs of this makeover was the great colonnaded street, which cut through the heart of Petra like a Roman spine. It wasn't just for looks, it was an infrastructure upgrade, allowing smoother traffic flow for carts, camels, and the occasional toga-clad administrator. On either side, shops, civic buildings, and temples popped up like architectural mushrooms, now adhering to Roman design codes. Practical? Yes. Aesthetic? Arguably. Subtle? Not even a little bit. But perhaps the most telling symbol of this cultural renovation was the amphitheatre. Now yes, Petra technically had an amphitheatre before Rome got involved, but Rome took one look at it and said, cute, let's double it. They expanded the structure, giving it that glorious semicircular symmetry Rome adored, with seating for over 6,000 people. The Nabateans had used it for civic ceremonies and perhaps music. Rome, being Rome, probably threw in some more violent entertainment. After all, what's a new colony without a few gladiator games? The changes weren't just architectural, they were economic and political too. Under Nabatean rule, Petra had been the beating heart of a trade empire. Its location was perfect. a crossroads for incense from Arabia, spices from India, silk from China, and absolutely no one got through without paying a toll. But Rome's annexation came with a nasty surprise. The trade monopoly began to crumble. Rome preferred building its own roads and ports to bypass Petra entirely. Instead of camels trudging into the city with expensive wares, ships now docked at Red Sea ports and delivered cargo to newer, flashier cities like Bostra. In other words, Petra went from must-stop hub of commerce to that cool old place with the fancy rocks. The gradual economic decline was matched by a slow cultural erosion. As Roman influence grew, Nabatean traditions began to fade. The Aramaic language used by Petra's locals slowly gave way to Greek and Latin. Temples once dedicated to Arab deities were rededicated or abandoned. Even the famous Nabatean script carved into tombs and monuments began disappearing from official records, replaced by inscriptions in the Roman alphabet. This wasn't instant cultural erasure, but it was a slow, steady watering down, like a cup of rich Nabatean coffee gradually diluted by too much Roman milk. Some locals no doubt adapted and even prospered under Roman rule, now wearing togas instead of robes and reciting poetry in Greek. But the soul of Petra, the fierce independence, the caravan-led commerce, the signature desert innovation was beginning to wither under the empire's shadow. And then there were the earthquakes, because when your economy's collapsing and your identity is being culturally overwritten, why not add a few tectonic insults to injury? The 4th and 5th centuries brought tremors that cracked the infrastructure, toppled columns, and generally made life a lot shakier, literally and figuratively. By the 6th century, Petra was no longer the jewel of Arabia. It was a city that had been passed down from empire to empire like an old heirloom, admired, altered, but ultimately forgotten in a drawer. The once bustling markets had quieted. The amphitheatre was more home to goats than governors, and the majestic tombs that had once boasted of eternal glory now watched silently as sand and time crept in. Still, if there's a silver lining to Petra's Roman makeover, it's this. It added a new layer to the city's already layered identity. Petra became not just Nabatean, but a mosaic of civilizations, a place where Eastern and Western styles danced awkwardly together, columns and camels side by side. In the end, Rome may have changed Petra's face, but it couldn't quite erase the spirit, because even under Roman columns, Petra still whispered, "This was ours first." One moment, Petra was the queen of the desert, glittering with commerce, culture, and cliff-carved confidence. The next, gone like a celebrity who ghosted fame before social media could notice. Petra didn't exactly leave the stage with a bow. It slipped behind a curtain of sand, trembled through catastrophe, and quietly vanished, as if trying to keep its dramatic flair even in collapse. Let's start with the headliner, the earthquake of 363 AD. Now, earthquakes are never polite guests, but this one was particularly catastrophic. It hit with the kind of force that makes buildings crumble, infrastructure disintegrate, and residents wonder if the gods were holding a grudge. Petra, despite its stone-cut swagger, was not immune. While its buildings were carved from cliffs, many of its internal features, columns, stairways, vaulted ceilings, were still vulnerable. Several major structures were flattened, aqueducts shattered, and roads split like cracked pottery. But it wasn't just the infrastructure that broke. It was the spirit of the city. After the quake, the population shrank. Repairs were sluggish. Trade routes, already rerouting due to regional shifts, detoured further away. Like a party that had lost its music, Petra began to empty. People packed up and moved on. The grand tombs and temples still stood, but without the buzz of life. They were less like vibrant city icons and more like eerily quiet stone spectators. And then came the sand. Petra's location, nestled in a basin surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs, was a visual masterpiece, but it was also a trap for the desert's creeping fingers. Without regular maintenance or bustling life, sandstorms gradually reclaimed the streets and plazas. Wind funneled through the sick, that dramatic canyon entrance, and dumped dunes like a passive-aggressive houseguest refusing to leave. Over decades, then centuries, Petra wasn't just forgotten, it was literally buried. Not under conspiracy or war, but under layers of time and dust. Meanwhile, the world kept spinning, empires rose and fell, new trade cities took the spotlight, and Petra, once the it-girl of ancient desert commerce, became a whispered name in forgotten scrolls. By the medieval era, European scholars knew of Petra only through vague biblical references and ancient Roman travelogues. It was a place that might have been somewhere in the sands of Arabia Petrea, a region as mysterious as it was unreachable. But here's the twist. Petra's obscurity was actually its secret weapon. The very thing that erased it from public memory also saved it, because it wasn't continuously looted, rebuilt, or paved over with Starbucks. Petra remained remarkably intact. It was like the desert's best-kept secret, an architectural time capsule with a sense of drama and mystery intact. Enter Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer with a thirst for lost legends. In 1812, while disguised as an Arab pilgrim, long story, he convinced a local guide to lead him to the rumored ruins of a city nestled in the mountains. Burckhardt's account of stumbling upon the grand facade of the treasury half buried in sand, glowing rose-red at sunset, reads like the plot of a historical thriller. But unlike most plot twists, this one really happened. His rediscovery reintroduced Petra to the Western world. Not with fanfare, but with curiosity. Archaeologists followed. So did artists, adventurers, and eventually filmmakers. But before it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site or a backdrop for Indiana Jones, Petra spent over a millennium in a desert-induced witness protection program. And that, paradoxically, is what preserved its magic. Petra's disappearance isn't just a story of decay, it's a masterclass in impermanence. No city, no matter how grand or well-chiseled, is immune to the forces of nature and time. Earthquakes remind us that rock isn't invincible. Trade shifts teach us that prosperity is never permanent. And sandstorms? They don't care how photogenic your facade is, they'll cover it anyway. Still, Petra's vanishing act wasn't the end. It was an intermission, a pause that made the rediscovery all the more spectacular. Because when Petra returned to the stage, it wasn't just a ruin, it was a revelation, a whisper from a forgotten empire carved into stone and wrapped in sand. For a city that spent over 1,000 years hiding under sand like an introvert at a party, Petra sure made a dramatic comeback. Not only did it go from wait where to one of the most iconic archaeological sites on the planet, but it also managed the rare feat of becoming both a World Heritage Site and a movie star. Eat your heart out, Rome. The curtain rose on Petra's second act in 1812, when Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt pulled off one of the greatest geographical glow-ups in history. Burckhardt wasn't your typical treasure hunter with a whip and a witty one-liner. He was more of a linguistically gifted nerd in disguise, literally. Fluent in Arabic and decked out as a Muslim traveler, he'd been poking around the Middle East looking for ancient sites while pretending to be a devout pilgrim. His cover story: he wanted to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron. Yes, that Aaron, Moses' brother, which, according to local law, sat atop a mountain near a mysterious ruined city, with a local guide leading him through the the narrow, dramatic canyon entrance that could make any traveler feel like they're walking into a movie set. Burckhardt emerged into a sunlit clearing and promptly lost his scholarly mind. Before him stood Petra's most famous monument, the treasury, half buried in sand, yet gleaming pink and red in the sunlight. It looked less like a ruin and more like a divine mirage. He wasn't allowed to linger lest he blow his cover, but he'd seen enough. The West's lost city had been found. For a while, Petra remained the kind of secret only archaeologists and obsessive travel writers knew about. It was remote, hard to reach, and surrounded by geopolitical question marks. But then came the 20th century, with its strange cocktail of adventure literature, camera-toting explorers, and a growing appetite for the ancient and exotic. Petra slowly began to inch back into the global consciousness, and then came the moment that really changed everything. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. In 1989, Harrison Ford and Sean Connery galloped straight into cinematic history, by bursting out of Petra's treasury like they were late for a mythological dentist appointment. Millions of people, many of whom had never heard of Petra, suddenly saw it towering on the silver screen and thought, "Where is that? And how do I get there without being chased by Nazis?" Thus began Petra's pop culture rebirth. Travel brochures couldn't print fast enough. "Lost City Rediscovered" became the tagline. The local Bedouins, who had once lived inside the carved tombs and sold tea to the odd academic, suddenly found themselves guiding busloads of tourists wielding selfie sticks and asking where the Holy Grail scene was shot. Spoiler, there's no Grail inside, just a very dusty room and a lot of confusion. In 1985, Petra was officially designated a World Heritage Site. The citation read like an archaeological love letter, one of the most precious cultural properties of man's cultural heritage. Basically, if ancient cities were in a beauty contest, Petra had just won Best in Show. The recognition added prestige, but also pressure. Because here's the thing about being globally adored. Everyone wants to visit you, and not everyone wipes their feet. Tourism exploded. Petra went from forgotten wonder to bucket list essential. And while that's been great for Jordan's economy, it's also come with a hefty price tag. Foot traffic has worn down sandstone steps that lasted centuries. Some of the intricate carvings, already weathered by time, are now being gently rubbed into oblivion by excited fingers and camera flashes. Preservationists now face the modern curse of heritage fame, protecting a site not from invaders or natural disaster, but from enthusiastic crowds, Instagrammers, and the occasional drone enthusiast who thinks Petra needs aerial coverage. Efforts have ramped up to balance access and conservation. Local authorities have rerouted visitor paths, imposed stricter rules, and even relocated Bedouin families who once lived in the caves. Archaeologists work side by side with digital scanners and climate monitors, because when your city is both a cultural treasure and a cinematic icon, you don't just need guards, you need curators, conservationists, and the occasional historian turned diplomat. Still, Petra endures. It remains one of the most breathtaking examples of ancient engineering, a rose-red echo of Nabati and ambition. And in the age of digital everything, its silent grandeur still commands awe. You don't need a filter to make the treasury glow. It does that all on its own. So yes, Petra nailed the rebranding campaign. From an abandoned ruin buried in sand to a global icon immortalized on film and protected by international law, it's the ultimate comeback story.